Chapter 105. All the way along the broken streets covered with moss and gravel, they soon came to a low-lying, desolate, open space. The area was extremely open. Dudeen could vaguely see the outline of the building from the street, but the upper part had long collapsed. Broken walls and concrete gravel wrapped with steel bars were piled up on the road and covered with vegetation. Glen's figure suddenly stopped and looked at somewhere in front of her. She raised her hand and said, "Gat, go and check it out." The one called Gat was the young thief who had the ability to change skin color. He nodded slightly, and the color of his body quickly changed. Even the black armor on his body disappeared. Dean was still surprised when he saw it again. He asked in a low voice, "Can his ability affect the armor?" "Of course not. His armor is specially customized from the Consortium. It is said that it is made from the skin and scales of the magic lizard. It can resonate with his ability." A young man next to him whispered. Dudeen subconsciously thought that if it was against the enemy, this ability was nothing to be afraid of. Like his own smell ability, he could easily restrain it. Even if he didn't have the sense of smell, as long as he splashed some dust or paint on the opponent's body, the discoloration ability would be completely useless. However, the terrible part of this ability was the sneak attack. It could quietly approach and kill. After all, even a strong person couldn't be vigilant all the time. After a moment, Gat returned and reported, "It is indeed a mountain lion. It has hunted a scythe-hand undead and is eating." Glen nodded slightly. "There are not many mountain lions. Black Weaver will certainly keep an eye on it. Let's wait here. Don't get too close." After saying that, she took out a bottle of pale yellow powder from her backpack, poured it into her palm, and gently sprinkled it on her tight-fitting armor. In an instant, her faint, fragrant body odor was covered by a thick stench of rotting corpses. The others were already experienced. They took out a bottle of the same pale yellow powder from their backpacks and smeared it all over their body. Their smell was immediately covered. Glen threw the bottle into Dean's hand. "This is undead powder. It can cover up the smell. But be careful not to smear it on your skin or it will get infected." Dean took it and thought that the effect of this thing was similar to the undead plasma he smeared when he escaped the pursuit of the defiler. In contrast, the smell of the rotten undead plasma was stronger and more thoroughly covered. However, once the blood was smeared on it, it was very troublesome to wipe it off, unlike this powder, which could be easily removed by patting it with a cloth. After the 7 people were all smeared with the undead powder, only the smell of the undead was left in the place. Glen glanced at the 6 people in the team and said, "Unluo, take the 2 of them to another direction and wait there. Be careful not to expose yourself. Signal if anything happens." Unluo's brown-haired young man nodded. Then, he turned around with the other 2 young men and left quietly. They followed the pile of rubble to another place. Dean couldn't help but ask, "Are we going to wait like this?" "That's the only way." Glen lowered her voice. Dean asked, "What if the Black Weaver doesn't come?" "Then we will continue to wait." Glen looked at him and said, "Hunting requires patience. Even if it is hungry, at least we still have food. Although there is more than one mountain lion in Area Number 1, there will be a time when it will run out." Dean thought that patience was good, but it was too stupid and inefficient to wait like this. He said, "I have an idea, but I don't know if it is feasible or not." Glen and the other 3 looked at him with some doubt and astonishment. They thought that he was just a newbie who had just come to hunt. Could it be that he had any ideas? Dean looked at Glen. "Area Number 1 is too big. It will be a waste of time if we wait. Maybe the Black Weaver is looking for food at the moment. Since the mountain lion is its favorite prey, I think the mountain lion should know how to avoid its natural enemies. Therefore, the mountain lion probably won't go to the areas where the Black Weaver will appear. In other words, the chances of the Black Weaver finding it are very small. So, it is better to take the initiative to find the Black Weaver and bring the mountain lion in front of it." Glenn and the others were surprised. They thought about it carefully and felt that what Dean said was reasonable. All creatures have the instinct to avoid their natural enemies. Mountain lions live in area number 1. Naturally, they have a very strong beast intuition. You are right. But it is easy to say but difficult to do. If we kill the mountain lion, although we can use the smell of its blood to lure it, but the black weaver is too cunning. A dead mountain lion will not be able to arouse its interest. Glenn shook her head. Dean said, "Of course not to kill it. Many beasts don't eat dead things. These monsters are no different from beasts. I mean, we should use the method of scaring the mountain lion so that it will panic and run around. The chances of attracting the black weaver's attention will naturally increase." Glenn and the other 3 were startled. They looked at each other. Yes, this is a good idea. The previous thief, Gat, couldn't help but clap his hands. The other man and woman couldn't help but look at Dean in surprise. They thought that this little melonhead was very smart. He could come up with such a clever idea. Glenn deeply looked at Dean and turned to Gat. "Call the 3 of them back." Garter immediately agreed and disappeared. Dean hesitated. "Although this method is efficient, but there is a drawback." "I know." Glenn didn't wait for him to say, "You don't have to worry. If we encounter other prey along the way, as long as it is below level 25, I can contain it by myself. I won't let the mountain lion die." Dean saw that she had considered this point, and he was relieved. If he didn't say it out loud, it would be his mistake if such a situation were to occur. Soon, the 3 who had left to squat came back. Unlua looked at Dean and said to Glenn, "Isn't this too rash?" "Let's do it." Glenn expressed her choice. She looked at the youth behind Unluo and said, "Shoot it." The youth with the bow was the only hunter in the team besides Dean. His ability wasn't tracking by smell, but ultrasonic hearing. He had heard the previous conversation between Dean and Glenn. He slightly nodded and moved forward hundreds of meters. He came to the top of a stone and exposed his upper body. He pulled the bow and pulled an arrow. He quickly aimed at the front and the arrow flew out. Roar! A painful scream echoed. It was particularly loud in the silent ruins. It was followed by the sound of galloping hooves running into the distance. Glenn, Dean and the others quickly followed. They saw the place where the mountain lion had stopped. There was a bloody carcass on the ground. The internal organs and other organs were scattered on the ground. Chapter 106. In the process of chasing, Dean finally saw the appearance of the mountain lion. It was similar to the lions he knew. The only difference was the size. It was 3 to 4 meters tall and had a strong physique. The hair on its body was like sharp needles. The forelimb joints had 3 sections. Its running posture was like a spider crawling on the ground. At the moment, there was an arrow at the end of its tail. The severe pain made the mountain lion scream and run away in panic. It didn't have the slightest cruel and bloodthirsty appearance. Dean and others were smeared with undead powder, so they were not afraid of exposing their whereabouts. They followed the mountain lion closely. The distance between them was only a few hundred meters. There is a smell in front. As Dean ran, he quickly sensed the surrounding scent. He had smelled these scents early on, but he didn't warn them until they were within 20 miles. Position. 11 o'clock direction. Glenn raised her hand and made a gesture. Garter, who was in the team, understood and disappeared. After a moment, Garter reappeared in the team and said, "It's a dead blood beast." Glenn said, "Don't pay attention to it. Continue to chase." Everyone followed the mountain lion. When the mountain lion was tired, the young hunter would pull out an arrow and shoot it. His archery was accurate and hit the target every time. On the way, occasionally some monsters of level 7 to 8 appeared. They hid in the dark and attacked Dean and others. The undead powder on their bodies made them look like walking corpses in the eyes of these monsters. Although most monsters have no appetite for ordinary walking corpses, some monsters below level 10 still like to eat this kind of fresh and juicy food with no spikes on the carapace. However, with Dean's sense of smell and the young hunter's strong hearing, these hidden monsters were discovered early on. Before they could attack, they were easily beheaded by Glenn. Her actions were clean and neat. The battle was almost finished in a few seconds. It was a complete crushing. Although the mountain lion was brutal, it was a little frightened when it was suddenly attacked. In its senses, it didn't know that the attack came from several walking dead behind it. It ran around in panic. Sometimes it was shot too painful, so it couldn't help but turn back and roar. However, it couldn't see the enemy, so it could only vent its anger on the walking dead behind it. The mountain lion's counterattack was expected by Glenn, Dean and the others. They quickly ran to other areas that they hadn't passed through. The plan was still going on. Occasionally it was more efficient. 2 hours later, everyone had used up most of their energy, so they stopped provoking the mountain lion and told it to rest. They also sat down nearby to rest. Such a big movement, won't it scare away the Black Weaver? A young man couldn't help but ask. Will you be scared by your own food? Glenn asked. The young man was rendered speechless. Dean took the bottle of water from Glenn. He felt uncomfortable as he thought that she had drunk from his mouth. He quietly wiped the mouth of the bottle and then lifted the bottle to drink from it. Glenn sneered as she saw this scene, but didn't say anything. Dean returned the bottle to her and was about to rest. Suddenly, his body's pores slightly shrank. He suddenly smelled a strange fishy smell approaching from about 30 miles away. This smell was the smell of the Black Weaver that he had smelled from the Black Fragment. It finally appeared. Dean rejoiced in his heart. The sooner he could complete the hunting mission, the sooner he could go back and continue training. Otherwise, every day he stayed in the dangerous area number 1, there was a possibility of changes happening. He didn't make a sound immediately, but waited quietly. Soon, the smell of the Black Weaver was about 25 miles away. At this time, the smell gradually faded, and the body seemed to disappear. Dean was startled. He was puzzled. What's wrong? Glenn looked at him. Dean saw that she was aware of his expression, and his heart shivered. Nothing. Glenn looked at him but didn't say anything. She sat down and rested. Her eyes fell on the mountain lion that had stopped walking slowly in the distance. A few minutes later, Dean suddenly smelled the smell of the Black Weaver that had disappeared before. It appeared again. Moreover, the place where the Black Weaver appeared was 8 miles away. The smell was extremely faint. It seemed that the Black Weaver was desperately trying to restrain itself. If the distance was not too close, it would be almost impossible for him to smell it. It's approaching very fast. Dean was shocked. He knew that he couldn't wait any longer. He immediately said to Glenn, "It appeared. It's coming here. It's about 7 miles away. No, it's even closer." Glenn and the other 5 were surprised. Gat anxiously said, "Why didn't you say so earlier? Isn't the range of your sense of smell 20 miles? Dean frowned. It used some method to hide its smell. It suddenly appeared 7 or 8 miles away. "Get ready," Glenn quickly said. "The Black Weaver likes to sneak attack underground." Dean was able to smell it from about 8 miles away. "It's very rare. Everyone prepare for battle. Gat, you protect Dean." Gat and the other 4 reacted. They thought that the Black Weaver's sneak attack had killed 3 of them even though there were hunters in the team. It was obvious that the Black Weaver's sneak attack ability was far beyond their imagination. They pulled out their weapons and were on full alert. Glenn stared at the mountain lion in the distance. Kill it at all costs. It's best not to make any mistakes. Yes. Gat and the others' faces slightly changed as they immediately responded. At this time, Dean smelled the smell of the Black Weaver. It was about 2 miles away. The young hunter in the team seemed to have heard the movement. He hurriedly said, "It's in the 4 o'clock direction. It's going to appear." Glenn stroked the jet-black dagger beside her leg and said in a low voice, "Get ready." At this time, the mountain lion seemed to be aware of something. It stopped and turned its head to look around. It growled in a low voice as if it was trying to intimidate something. With a puff, the ground beneath it suddenly cracked open. A sharp and long black blade pierced through the soft abdomen of the mountain lion and pulled downwards. Crash! The liver and other bloody organs fell out. Large and small intestines, blood vessels and other parts were washed out along with a large amount of blood. Roar! The mountain lion roared in grief and indignation. It twisted its limbs to struggle, but it was like a trapped beast in a cage. The ground around it cracked one after another. Sharp black thorns shot out from the ground and penetrated the body of the mountain lion. It was as if it was nailed to death by several black thorns. Whoosh! A ghost-like shadow flashed past. It was Glenn. Chapter 107. Squeak! A subtle sharp sound came from the soil under the mountain lion's feet. 4 or 5 black spikes pierced the mountain lion's body, quickly shrank back into the soil, leaving only a few bowl-sized holes. Want to run? Glenn raised her eyebrows. She didn't expect that the Black Weaver, who was a level 26 hunter, wouldn't have a bit of backbone. Even though it was injured, it still wanted to escape. Glenn's reaction was quick. She bent down and grabbed her dagger. She stabbed into one of the holes. The dagger seemed to have pierced something in the soil. A painful scream came from inside, but soon there was no more sound. Come out! Glenn's heart was filled with hatred. The 2 daggers in her hands suddenly flew out like a rotating knife dance. The soil under the dagger was quickly pried up and dug a deep hole. At this time, the other 3 quickly arrived. One of them, a young knight, let out a loud shout. He raised his spear and thrust it into one of the holes in the ground. When the spear was halfway in, it seemed to have stabbed something and stopped. The other 2 people saw this and hurriedly moved closer. The young knight poured all of his strength into the spear. The veins on his arms bulged. He clenched his teeth and breathed out a big breath of hot air. He suddenly lifted the spear and stabbed again in the same place. Clang! A hard force was transmitted from the bottom of the spear. The knight couldn't help but be startled. At this time, the other youth's complexion suddenly changed. He hurriedly turned back and said, "Dodge!" He hadn't finished his words when a black spike suddenly ejected from the soil behind the knight. It was like a scorpion's tail swinging towards his back. Puff! Suddenly, the black spike snapped in the air. It was Glenn, who had mysteriously appeared behind the young knight. The dagger in her hand was stained with green blood, and her face was full of murderous intent. She quickly inserted the dagger into the leggings, and then raised her hand to grab the retracted part of the spike and pulled it with all her might. The knight reacted. His whole body was drenched in cold sweat. He quickly turned around and angrily thrust his spear towards the place where the spike was exposed. There was a scream from the ground. Suddenly, 4 or 5 black spikes shot out of the soil. There was no warning and the speed was extremely fast. There was almost no time to react. The sword-wielding youth from before seemed to have anticipated this and reacted first, swinging his sword to block. The other young man was not so lucky. His reaction was a bit slower, and one of the black spikes pierced into his thigh. The flexible hunting armor did not have much resistance, and it was pierced through instantly. The tip of the spike pierced into his thigh, and a small part of the sharp horn poked out from the back of his thigh. The young man screamed in pain and brandished his saber in terror. With a clanging sound, the sharp blade was unable to cut through the black spike. The layer of shiny black carapace on its surface was extremely tough, causing the blade to easily slip. The black spikes swung and dragged the young man's thighs along with it. The tearing pain made him sweat profusely. He tried his best to endure it, but the pain still made his face contorted. He could only swing his saber again and again, but the effect was not good, only leaving a few white marks. Dean and Gat were horrified as they saw the scene from the distance. They knew that Glenn was able to easily cut off the black spike. However, they knew how tough and terrifying it was. Whoosh! Suddenly, an arrow tore through the air. With a bang, the arrow hit the black spike and immediately skidded, deviating from its path. Dean knew that it was the previous hunter who shot the arrow from behind. However, the shape of the black spike was oval, and the surface was smooth and tough. If it was not an arrow with strong penetrating power, it would be easy to deflect it. Dean secretly thought that if he could make some small spikes on the arrowhead, then it might play a role. At this time, the young knight hurriedly turned around to help the young man with the saber. The long spear angrily struck a joint in the middle of the black spike, and with a puff sound, the sharp spearhead immediately cut it off along the weak point of the joint. However, the power of the spear was also transmitted through the black spike to the young knife's thigh. The severe tearing pain made his whole body tremble, and he screamed in pain. His hands tightly held his thigh, and a trace of reason was squeezed out from his thigh. He struggled to pull out the broken part of the black spike so that the blood wouldn't splash on his wound. Glen's body swayed as she dodged the black spike that shot out from under her feet. At the same time, she struggled to pull out the half of the black spike in her hand. From time to time, there were sharp cries full of pain and anxiety coming from the soil. In the midst of this thrilling tug-of-war, a sorrowful and angry roar came from the side. It was the mountain lion that was dripping with blood. It was on the verge of death. It roared ferociously as it rushed towards Glen and the others. Glen and the others were caught in a bitter battle. They didn't expect to be attacked by the mountain lion. All of them were surprised. The young man wielding the sword quickly waved his sword to meet the attack. The skin of his arm bulged with fine scales. The fat in the surface layer of the skin turned into a hardened cuticle, and the defense increased several times. The mountain lion fiercely collided with the young man's chest. Bang! Although the young man's block was effective, but the difference in strength between the two sides was too big. The young man was hit and flew upside down. He continued to roll a few times. He hurriedly stabilized his body. But before he could get up, his body trembled. A black spike stained with blood emerged from his back and pierced through his chest. "No!" The young knight glared angrily. He roared and rushed over while waving his spear. Glen heard the sound and looked back. Her face couldn't help but change. She clenched her teeth and bent her body slightly. Her slender legs seemed to have a subtle change. There seemed to be something protruding from the black armor on her knees. At the same time, the strength of her arm seemed to have increased a lot. The black spike that she was pulling on seemed to be stretched taut. The back half of the spike's joint was faintly torn. Suddenly, the ground suddenly puffed up. A black giant suddenly flew out from the ground. Glen, who was struggling to pull, continued to step back. It was as if her opponent had suddenly let go of the rope in a tug-of-war. She suddenly lost her strength and involuntarily retreated. The black spike in her hand was impressively one of the legs of the black giant. At this moment, the black giant used Glen's pulling strength to quickly rush towards her. Several black spike-like legs flanked her from both sides. It seemed as if they wanted to hug Glen. Glen had been holding back her strength because she had considered such a situation. But after seeing the sword-wielding youth killed, her heart was filled with anger. Her body couldn't help but burst out with strength that exceeded the range that she could bear. Moreover, she didn't think that the Black Weaver would be so insidious. It seemed that she had been waiting for this moment. At this moment, she saw the black giant pouncing straight towards her. Her complexion changed. She hastily twisted her body. There was a faint layer of fluorescence on her skin. Her feet suddenly turned and her body twisted in an incredible posture. She lowered her body to avoid the black giant. Whoosh! At the same time, 4 arrows were shot from a distance. Chapter 108. As the Black Weaver landed on the ground, everyone finally saw its appearance. Its body was like a giant spider. Its height was about 2 meters and its body length was nearly 5 meters. There were 8 black spiky spider legs under its abdomen. Each leg had 3 joints and was flexible. At the front of the legs were 2 crab pincers. From the inside of the pincers, It was obvious that its destructive power was extremely terrifying. Every part of its body was covered with a black hard shell. There was no hair. Its abdomen was extremely bloated like a spider's belly. But at the end of the abdomen, there was a hard scaly tail. It was like a thick whip covered with spikes. Dean saw the Black Weaver from afar. There was a chill in his heart. From its ferocious appearance, he knew that its combat effectiveness was extremely terrifying. He couldn't help but worry about Glenn. Squeak! The Black Weaver screamed. It was full of impatience and anger. At the moment, 4 of its 8 legs were broken. One of them was an old wound that was still in the process of regenerating. At the moment, the remaining 4 legs were supporting its body. It was staring at Glenn like a tiger watching its prey. When Glenn saw that it finally came out of the soil, she knew that it wouldn't be able to run away for a while. She felt relieved, and at the same time, her previously suppressed killing intent couldn't stop boiling. Her arm shook slightly, and the dagger tied to her leg was sucked into her hand like a magnet. She pulled it out so fast that it was hard to see it clearly. Obviously, she was proficient in it. She held the dagger with both hands and stared at the Black Weaver. Step by step, she approached the Black Weaver. Although she was good at sneak attacks and assassinations, but there was no one in the team who could pin down the Black Weaver. She could only play the role of a warrior. On the flat head of the Black Weaver, 2 scarlet eyes were staring at Glenn. Transparent mucus was dripping from the back of its chin. Suddenly, the Black Weaver's 4 legs sprang towards Glenn. Glenn's face was incomparably cold. There wasn't the slightest trace of fear on her face. The moment the Black Weaver pounced on her, she reacted extremely quickly. Her body flashed like a shadow as she quickly jumped towards the Black Weaver's side to chop it. The Black Weaver didn't have enough time to react to Glenn's sneak attack. However, its head suddenly turned to the left, and a white filamentous substance shot out from its mouth. Glenn's complexion changed slightly. She quickly rotated her body to divert the force and changed the direction of her attack. After avoiding the white silk-like object, Glenn quickly exerted force on her feet and approached the Black Weaver again. The dagger in her hand quickly chopped at the sharp leg of the Black Weaver. Whether it was the location of the attack or the angle of the attack, it seemed to be just right. Dean's eyes lit up. Previously, Glenn had avoided Bai's attack. It was not so much an evasion, but an adjustment in position, so that the next attack would be more accurate and ruthless. Puff! The Black Weaver's sharp leg broke and fell to the ground. Squeak! The Black Weaver screamed in pain like nails scratching glass, extremely harsh. The blood vessels on Dean's forehead throbbed, and he felt a bit dizzy and headache. Glenn didn't seem to be affected. After landing, she rushed forward again. She didn't give the Black Weaver a chance to breathe. The Black Weaver's body fell to the ground, but it didn't jump again. Instead, it suddenly crouched down. When Glenn attacked again, the Black Weaver's tail suddenly swept out. Glenn's face changed as she heard the sound of the wind. She hurriedly dodged sideways. Once again, the distance between the Black Weaver and the Black Weaver was pulled apart. All of this happened in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, and it only took a short 2 to 3 seconds. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. At this time, the hunter-archer continued to shoot arrows at the Black Weaver. One of the arrows was aimed at the Black Weaver's eyeball, but the position was slightly off by half a centimeter. It stabbed the hard part under the eyeball. Half a centimeter deviation caused a huge difference in the outcome. It showed how important the accuracy of the bow and arrow was. Dean and Gat were watching the battle from the side. They felt sorry for him. At this time, the knight and the sword-wielding youth separated and surrounded the Black Weaver from 3 different directions. The Black Weaver was lying on the ground, looking around. It seemed that it was difficult to deal with the Black Weaver. The knight and the sword-wielding youth didn't dare to act rashly. They knew that they didn't have any fighting ability compared to the Black Weaver. The only thing they could do was to help Glenn so that she wouldn't get injured or fall into a desperate crisis. Glenn was slightly panting. She wasn't in a hurry to act. She was waiting. The Black Weaver seemed to gradually become impatient. Its body was bleeding because of the broken legs. It was gradually losing its physical strength. If it continued to wait, it would only get weaker. It looked at Glenn and the knight. It seemed to be looking for the right opportunity to attack. For a time, the open space was silent. After a few minutes, the restless Black Weaver finally couldn't help but pounce on the knight. The knight's face changed. He hurriedly retreated and waved his spear in warning. However, the Black Weaver pounced on the knight. It used its crab pincers to clamp the spear. Gotcha! The sturdy spear was easily broken. When the Black Weaver attacked the knight, Glenn also found an opportunity. She immediately attacked from another direction. Feeling her approach, the Black Weaver immediately turned around and bit her. It was as if the previous attack on the knight was just a cover. The knight was relieved as he was out of the attack range. He hurriedly narrowed the range of the attack. He waved the broken spear to distract the Black Weaver's attention so that it couldn't concentrate on Glenn. The shape of Glenn's calves was somewhat curved, unlike the straight legs of a normal human. Because of this, her speed had reached a terrifying level. Under the attack of the Black Weaver, Glenn's body twisted and turned, unexpectedly dodging all of the attacks. She was like a weightless dust. No matter how fierce the storm was, it couldn't knock her down. Puff! Glenn suddenly rushed forward. While the Black Weaver was being harassed by the knight and the sword-wielding youth, she fiercely slashed the side of its head. The sharp dagger pierced into the Black Weaver's head and quickly pulled out. The jagged dents on the dagger were quickly torn apart. The capillaries and veins were crushed, causing a great degree of bleeding. The Black Weaver screamed and turned around to bite back. But Glenn had already retreated, so she bit empty air. The knight and the sword-wielding youth were happy to see that their harassment was effective. They harassed the Black Weaver even harder. Chapter 109. More and more blood was flowing out of the Black Weaver's neck. The sharp pain and the loss of physical strength made it panic. It wanted to escape. But Glenn and the knight were experienced hunters. They didn't give it a chance to rush out of the encirclement. Once the Black Weaver pounced on them, they quickly retreated. They didn't want to confront it head-on. After repeated clashes, the Black Weaver's physical strength was getting weaker and weaker. Its movements were getting slower and slower. Even the knight could easily avoid its attacks. Glenn saw that the time was almost right. She seized the opportunity and suddenly pounced on the Black Weaver's back. The sharp dagger was like a fong. It fiercely stabbed the Black Weaver's side abdomen. However, the originally slow and powerless Black Weaver suddenly turned its head. Its reaction was amazing. It turned back and spat out a white silk-like substance towards Glenn. The silk-like substance was ejected at an extremely fast speed. It instantly hit Glenn and wrapped her hands and feet. At the same time, the white silk seemed to have a strong corrosive effect. Glenn's hunting armor was gradually corroded. The reversal of the situation surprised everyone. Glenn hurriedly rolled back to avoid the follow-up attack of the Black Weaver. However, the Black Weaver seemed to have gone mad. She didn't give up and continued to chase after her. Glenn was horrified. She hurriedly dodged left and right. At this time, the knight and the knight saw that the situation was not good. They rushed forward to contain the Black Weaver. At the same time, the hunter quickly shot arrows in an attempt to disrupt the Black Weaver's attack. In the face of the three people, the Black Weaver was wholeheartedly chasing after Glenn. At the moment, the upper half of Glenn's body was wrapped by the white silk. The surface of the hunting armor had been corroded. It was estimated that the silk would touch the inner armor and then the skin. At that time, it would cause very serious damage. At the moment, Glenn didn't have time to clean up the white silk. She could only dodge in panic. Dean's face changed. Glenn would be in danger if this continued. He no longer hesitated and said to Gat, "Let's go and help." Gat was surprised. He didn't respond. Dean pulled out the bow on his back and trotted to a position more than 200 meters in front of the young hunter. After all, his effective range was not as far as the young hunter. His range was at most 100 meters. Moreover, he could only hit a stationary target within 100 meters. Fortunately, the Black Weaver was so intent on killing Glenn that he didn't even pay attention to the knight and the sword-wielding youth. Dean followed the Black Weaver until he was within 100 meters of it. He quickly pulled out the arrow and aimed at the Black Weaver's head. At this moment, he immediately realized the difference between shooting a moving target and a stationary one. Black Weaver's constantly shaking head made it difficult for him to aim. He couldn't help but feel a bit irritated. He took a deep breath and stared at Black Weaver's head. From the messy trajectory and continuous ups and downs, he gradually found a familiar trajectory. It was the pattern of Black Weaver's movements. Whoosh! Dean loosened the bowstring and the arrow flew through the air. Bang! The arrow fell on the hard shell of the Black Weaver's mouth. It only left a small dent and then fell to the ground. Dean wasn't discouraged. He quickly loaded the arrow and shot the second arrow. Bang! The arrow still hit the hard shell of the Black Weaver's head. It didn't cause any damage, nor did it attract the Black Weaver's attention. At this time, Glenn was forced into a street corner by the Black Weaver. Behind her was a pile of collapsed stones. Usually it would be like walking on flat ground, but at this moment it was a great obstacle for her to dodge. She tripped and suddenly fell down. Her face couldn't help but change. The Black Weaver roared and rushed over. Its flat head was going to bite her. Glenn hurriedly held the dagger and stared at the lower part of the Black Weaver's head. It was the joint of the hard shell and also the fatal part. This was her only chance to survive. She had to fight for it. At this moment of life and death, Dean suddenly narrowed his eyes. The moment Glenn fell down, he didn't feel anxious. Instead, he was particularly ethereal. His mind instinctively emerged the next move of the Black Weaver. He loosened his fingers and the arrow flew through the air. Puff, puff. 2 continuous splashes of blood sounded. The Black Weaver screamed pitifully and fell down. His heavy body pressed down on Glenn's body, covering her. Dean quickly looked and saw the arrow inserted in the Black Weaver's blood-red eyes. His heart burst with joy. Then he thought of Glenn's safety. He couldn't help but tighten his heart. He clenched the bow and waited for the 2 nearby knights to check. If the Black Weaver still had the strength to fight, he was ready to retreat first. The 2 knights cautiously stepped forward. They immediately saw a large amount of blood flowing from the Black Weaver's head. They looked at each other. Suddenly, the Black Weaver's body slightly arched. The 2 were shocked. When they looked again, it was Glenn who was dripping with blood. She crawled out from under the Black Weaver's body. Her whole body was stained with blood and a rancid smell. Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when they saw this. Glenn used a dagger to cut off the white silk on her body. Although her body was stained with blood, there was an unprecedented happy smile on her face. But the smile was bathed in blood and looked particularly strange. Dean looked at the blood on her body. He suddenly thought that at the moment she should be absorbing the parasitic magic worm from the Black Weaver's blood. Once the parasitic magic worm occupied the position of her previous magic marks, it would replace the previous magic marks. During the hunter training, Dean learned that each person could only master one kind of magic mark. Once there were 2 parasitic magic worms in a human or monster's body, they would kill each other. Just like a mountain can't accommodate 2 tigers. One must die. Of course, there was an extremely small chance that the 2 parasitic magic worms would be evenly matched and perish together. Once the parasitic magic worm entered the human body, it would quickly die. The corpse would turn into magic mark. If a new parasitic magic worm came, it would eat the corpse of the previous parasitic magic worm. The parasitic magic worm would also die and turn into new magic marks. This made Dean very curious. Why could the parasitic magic worm survive in the monster's body but die in the human body? However, He didn't go deep into it. This question was probably a puzzle that the major consortia and the Holy Church were eager to solve. It's finally dead. The knight poked the Black Weaver's body. He was relieved to see that the Black Weaver was no longer moving. He looked at Glenn. Are you okay? Glenn smiled. I'm better than ever. He suddenly thought of something and said to the young hunter who was walking over from afar, It's all thanks to your arrow that hit its eye just now, which caused its body to deviate, allowing me to hit it in one shot. The hunter was embarrassed. I didn't shoot that arrow. It was Dean. If it was before, he would have called Dean little guy. But after seeing the accuracy of the arrow, he didn't dare to underestimate the newcomer. Dean. Glenn was surprised. She turned to look at Dean and Gat. She saw the bow in Dean's hand. She remembered that Dean was also a hunter. She couldn't help but exclaim, You are a scavenger. How long have you been training in the consortium? Your archery skills are comparable to that of a professional hunter. Dean knew that the arrow was completely luck. There was still a big gap between him and the hunter. He said, I was just lucky. It's great that I was able to help you. Glenn smiled and said, You've helped me a lot. I really have to thank you this time. Chapter 110. Its magic marks. Have you absorbed it? Gat rushed over and looked at Glenn, who was covered in blood. He couldn't help but ask. Dean and others' eyes were focused on Glenn. In addition to Dean, the knight and others were envious of her. Although they knew that the magic marks wouldn't fall into their hands, but they still couldn't help but be excited. Yes. Glenn slightly nodded and smiled. This time thanks to everyone's help. I will remember this favor. If you need anything after we return to the giant wall, don't hesitate to tell me. The hunter and others were modest and polite as they heard her words, but in their hearts they were very happy. They knew that a senior hunter would remember their favor. In the future, it would be useful. Dean looked at the dead swordsman. Should we take his body back or bury it on the spot? Glenn looked back and sighed. His body has been infected. It's currently in a suspended animation state. Once the devil's power engulfs his soul, he will become an undead. Let's incinerate him. The hunter and others couldn't help but feel sad. This should be the only pain of this trip. I will take his sword back. The knight picked up the sword from the ground. His expression was a bit down. I have performed 3 missions with him. I didn't expect that this time. We will be separated forever. Gat came forward and patted his shoulder. He sighed but didn't say anything. Life and death was a very distant thing for ordinary people. It was difficult to experience it a few times in their life, but for them, they had long been accustomed to it. In fact, they were gradually numb to it. The knife-wielding youth and the hunter found some flammable object. They used a fire sickle and piled them on top of the sword-wielding youth's body. They incinerated the body. The red gunpowder reflected on everyone's face. It was extremely hot. When the fire extinguished, there was only a charred corpse left on the ground. Glenn came forward and cut off the head of the corpse and buried it on the spot. After dealing with the sword-wielding youth's body, Glenn stood up and went to the side to dissect the body of the Black Weaver. The hunter youth and the sword-wielding youth came forward to help. The 3 of them were quite skilled. They cut along the gaps and mucous membranes on the inside of the hard shell, peeled off the hard shell, collected the pieces one by one, and piled them neatly at the side. Dean stepped forward to watch their dissection. This was a rare learning opportunity. Although he had learned to dissect some ordinary beasts during the scavenger special training, it was extremely difficult to completely dissect the useful parts of such a monster with a complex body structure. Following the dissection, blood flowed everywhere, and the pungent smell of blood assaulted their nostrils. Organs and other organs rolled down, entangling with the intestines. Dean watched quietly. Perhaps it was because the dissecting object was a monster, but he didn't feel nauseous. Soon, the hard shell, head, spiky limbs, pincers, and other parts were dismembered. Dean saw Glenn cut open its head and took out a white soft thing from a groove in its jaw. Judging from her expression, it should be valuable and useful material. Strange, it turned out to be empty. Was it done before? At this time, the sword-wielding youth who had cut open the belly of the Black Weaver said in a strange tone. Glenn heard the words and looked over. In addition to the internal organs and other organs, the back of the belly was empty and flat. Dean was puzzled. The next moment, he knew from their dialogue that they were talking about the ovaries. It should have laid eggs before coming out to hunt. Glenn made a speculation and shook her head. No, the survival rate of the eggs is low. It's very difficult to hatch them. Even if it hatches, the parasitic monster inside the body is still very weak and can't form magic mark. The sword-wielding youth was a bit regretful. He could only continue to collect other useful parts. Dean saw the youth take out a mass of yellow liquid from the inner wall of the belly. What is this? It's fat. The sword-wielding youth looked at Dean. It seemed that he remembered the previous praise from Glenn. His attitude was much gentler. This is a good fuel for the oil lamp. It's used by nobles. Dean didn't think that some of the oil lamps in the wall would come in this way. Soon, they had completely decomposed the huge Black Weaver. All the valuable parts were neatly piled together. The remaining internal organs and flesh were scattered all over the ground. In order to prevent other monsters from eating it, Glenn burned it with a big fire and buried it. The air was filled with a strong pungent smell. It was like cooked meat was soaked in blood. It was extremely fishy. Dean covered his nose. Suddenly, he smelled the residue of the Black Weaver on the ground. The smell was getting stronger and stronger. It seemed that the smell was coming from the soil. Dean was surprised. He couldn't help but look over. He saw that the soil was fluffy compared to the soil next to it. He suddenly remembered Glenn's words. Could it be, Captain? At this time, the hunter youth suddenly said, Now that the hunt is over, I want to go to other areas. It's rare to come outside the giant wall. I have to bring something back. My hands are itching. Glenn was putting the parts of the Black Weaver into a large storage bag. She looked at him and said, Yes, but I've just absorbed the magic marks. My strength has weakened. I need to go back to the giant wall to rest. It's dangerous for you to go alone. It's okay. I heard that there is a team in area number 6. I'll join them and get some materials. The hunter youth laughed. Glenn thought for a moment and said, Well, it's up to you. Dean's heart moved. He thought of the cold crystals he had stored in area number 9. He immediately said, I also want to go. You? Glenn looked at him and frowned. Area number 6 is too dangerous. There are a lot of monsters that are above level 10. It's easy to attract the attention of monsters. You shouldn't go. Dean said, I'll go to other areas to hunt for undeads. The cold crystals in their heads are very valuable. I'm short of money recently. Hunt undeads? Glenn thought for a moment and said, All right, but the value of cold crystals is quite low. If you are in urgent need of money, I can lend you some. As long as it doesn't exceed 100,000 gold coins, I can still give it to you. Dean was secretly speechless. 100,000 gold coins? It was an astronomical number. It was enough to buy a small town in the residential area. No, I'm short of money. I can earn it by myself, Dean said. Seeing this, Glenn could only say, All right, then I'll escort you there. Chapter 111. Glenn quickly put all the parts of the Black Weaver into a large foldable storage bag in her backpack. She carried it on her back, and it looked even bigger than her slender body. Dean saw that everyone was ready to leave. He hesitated but said, There seems to be something there. He pointed to the ground that was exuding the smell. Although he had some guesses in his heart, but considering his own ability, he decided to bring it up. Oh! Glenn looked over in surprise and said, There's a smell? It's in the soil, Dean said. After the previous accurate tracking, everyone had full trust in Dean's ability to smell. They looked at each other and cautiously approached with weapons in hand. Glenn winked at the knight. The latter understood and stepped forward. He picked up the soil that Dean was pointing at. After digging out a pit of about 30 centimeters, everyone immediately saw an oval snow-white object in the sand. Glenn and the others' eyes suddenly lit up. They were pleasantly surprised. Black Weaver's egg. They quickly moved forward and dug the sand. They found that there were as many as 8 Black Weaver eggs buried inside. Dean was happy and regretful that his guess was right. Unfortunately, his strength was too weak. Otherwise, he would have been able to sneak back to get the eggs. However, the area number 1 was too dangerous. Even an intermediate hunter didn't dare to go alone. Although he had a super sense of smell that could detect monsters in advance, but there were some lurking monster hunters who knew how to hide their smell. They would often quietly approach their prey. Such monsters were not uncommon in Area Number 1. The so-called people die for wealth and birds die for food. He thought about it again and again. In the end, he didn't want to take the risk. After all, God didn't care about him every time. Glenn looked at the 8 Black Weaver eggs in her hand. She was pleasantly surprised. I got so many at once. Maybe one of them will survive. Then I will absorb the Black Weaver's magic marks. My ability will be even stronger. The knight and others immediately congratulated him. Dean suddenly noticed that the hunter was smiling and congratulating him. But his expression was a bit stiff. Because of the height difference between them, it was easy for him to see the other's palm. He saw that the other's palm was clenched tightly. His thumb was slightly rubbing. It seemed that he was trying to endure something. Dean couldn't help but be startled. The next moment he woke up and couldn't help but smile. Previously, when the Black Weaver was lying on the ground, I thought it was to deal with us. I didn't expect that it was actually taking the opportunity to hide its eggs. Glenn recalled the previous battle and sighed. She thought of something and looked at Dean. Fortunately, you observed carefully. Otherwise you would have missed the 8 eggs. Dean smiled but didn't say anything. He felt helpless in his heart. Although it was unintentional, but he seemed to have offended the young hunter. The latter had ultrasonic hearing ability, so he should have heard the sound of Black Weaver burying the eggs. Moreover, he proposed to go to the 6th area to hunt. It was obviously an excuse. Clearly, he wanted to wait for everyone to leave, and then sneak back to get the eggs. However, his plan had been inadvertently ruined by himself. Moreover, his thoughts had been exposed in front of Glenn, the young knight, and the others. After all, no one was stupid. They just didn't show it at this moment. He probably hates me. Dean looked up at the young hunter, but saw that there was a smile on his face. It seemed that the young hunter didn't notice him. If it was an ordinary person, most of them would think that he was thinking too much. But Dean still felt that he couldn't let go of his guard. He secretly remembered the appearance of the young hunter. If he met him outside the giant wall in the future, it would be better to stay away from him as far as possible. Otherwise, if he was secretly retaliated, then he would fall into a situation of eternal damnation. It is entirely Dean's credit that we were able to find these 8 eggs by accident. Glenn looked at Dean and thought for a moment. According to the price handed over to the consortium, each rare monster's egg will be worth 1,000 gold coins. Ordinary monster's egg will be worth 500 gold coins. As for the mammal's egg, it's another matter. The survival rate is relatively high, and the value is sky high. I will distribute the eggs according to the price given by the consortium. In view of Dean's credit, 4 of the 8 eggs will belong to Dean. That is 4,000 gold coins. The rest will be 1,000 gold coins for each of you. As for the eggs, I will give them to the consortium to help me cultivate them. Hearing Glenn's distribution, the young knight and others didn't have any objection. Dean was surprised to see that Glenn had allocated so much to him. He thought that it would be good if he could drink the soup. He didn't expect to get half of it. His impression of her improved a lot. This time I have to thank Dean's nose. The young knight smiled. Gat also smiled and patted Dean's shoulder. Good job. Dean smiled and said a few polite words to them. After Glenn had collected the 8 eggs, everyone retreated along the original path. Along the way, Dean's sense of smell and young hunters' hearing allowed them to encounter several monster ambushes not far from where they were passing. They would suddenly jump out and attack them, almost causing casualties. Fortunately, Glenn reacted quickly and took the initiative to resist. Through the fight, Dean gradually had an understanding of Glenn's strength. She could easily deal with monsters below level 20, but it would be a lot more difficult for her to deal with monsters above level 20. Moreover, the higher the level, the more difficult it would be. If she encountered a monster like the Black Weaver who was level 26, her life would be in danger if she encountered it alone. After all, if Dean didn't help her to detect the Black Weaver's sneak attack, Glenn may not be able to detect it in time. Under the escort of Glenn, everyone gradually withdrew from area number 1. They came to the giant forest next to the abandoned highway. Glenn let the young knight, Gat and others go back first. She continued to escort Dean to the cleaned area, which was the area number 7. The last time Dean was scavenging, the area number 7 was still in the process of cleaning. Now the cleaning was coming to an end. Even if there were occasional monsters left, a primary hunter's strength was enough to escape. Unless they were unlucky enough to encounter the strongest monsters in the area number 7. After sending Dean to area number 7, Glenn said a few words and then turned to leave. Dean had asked her about the route of each area. Moreover, he had seen Scott's map before. He still had some impression of the area number 7 was not far from the area number 9. Moreover, he was fully armed so he could hunt in the area no. Dean saw a lot of undead swaying on the road. He had heard from Glenn and others that these undead were the last monsters to be cleaned. Unless they encountered them, they would kill them. Generally, they wouldn't take the initiative to look for them. In the first cleaning of each area, they would hunt the monsters that were given a name. They were the most terrible monsters in the area. Monsters that could reach the level of being given a name were far more powerful than ordinary monsters. If they were the first to hunt the undead on a large scale, it would alert the monsters. Some of the monsters would escape to other areas, especially to the areas of other consortia. It was tantamount to becoming the property of other consortia. Chapter 112. Compared to other beast-type monsters, hunting rank 4 ordinary walking corpses was the favorite of junior hunters. They would simply follow the body's instincts and use traps, lures and other skills to easily hunt them. Unlike other monsters, they had long cultivated a beast-like survival instinct. Even the weak bone-biter rat knew how to avoid danger. It was difficult to capture them with ordinary traps. However, if these ordinary undeads evolved into sickle undeads through a lot of food, their physical qualities would rise sharply. Their combat effectiveness would increase by leaps and bounds. They would be able to fight against intermediate hunters. Moreover, they would evolve a simple consciousness and would not be easily hunted by external forces. Dean had previously seen sickle undeads in area number 1. At this moment, he could distinguish at a glance that these were just ordinary undeads, so he dared to boldly trap and hunt them. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Arrows flew out one by one. His effective range was 100 meters. The height of 100 meters was actually the height of a 24 or 5-story building. Most of the residential buildings were about 4 to 5 meters high, which was a normal specification. At the moment, Dudian was standing at a commanding position. It was the top of a crumbling building that was seriously corroded by moss. It was about 20 floors high and about 80 meters from the ground. All the undeads that were attracted by the stones were within his effective range. The arrows accurately hit the running undead. Their movement trajectory was extremely easy to capture. After the previous high-intensity experience of shooting the Black Weaver, Dean felt a lot more relaxed when he shot these undead. At least the prediction of their movements would not be too hard. It was easy to hit them. The sharp arrows from above penetrated the undead's head and nailed them to the ground. Occasionally, there were arrows that penetrated the undead's shoulder collarbone or pierced the face. The strong force drove the undead's body away from the ground. The undeads that had no pain continued to climb up after falling and ran in the direction of the sound source. Dean continued to pull out the arrows, shoot, pull out the arrows and shoot again. The undeads fell one after another. Soon, the arrows in Dean's quiver were used up. He could not help but smile bitterly. Looking at more and more undeads gathered on the street, he immediately went to the other side of the building, grabbed some stones and threw them into the distance. The stones fell on the adjacent street, and the sound of shattering was louder in the silent ruins. The undead's ears were particularly sensitive, and they immediately gathered there. Dean took the opportunity to go downstairs. He coated his body with the undead powder that Glenn had given him. He went to the corpses on the ground and cut off their heads. He carried 7 or 8 heads and went back to the building. He found a corner and squatted down. He quickly cut open the heads and found the cold crystals inside. He collected them. After all the 8 heads were cut off, Dean ran out and continued to cut off the heads of the remaining undead. He secretly dissected them in the corner. After repeating this process 3 times, Dean collected all the cold crystals in the brains of the undeads he shot. At the same time, all the arrows he shot were recovered. Dean didn't rush to continue hunting. Instead, he returned to the top of the building. He held one of the cold crystals, bit his finger and dripped blood on it. When the cold crystal came into contact with the warm blood, it was like ice coming into contact with extremely hot boiling water. The spot where the blood dripped rapidly sank and melted, turning into a silver-like transparent liquid. Dean continued to observe. When the blood melted to the center of the cold crystal, it stopped. It seemed that the remaining temperature was insufficient. As time went by, the temperature of the blood had cooled down, but the cold crystal still maintained the appearance of melting. It was motionless and didn't freeze the blood in the pit into ice. Dean was relieved to see this, but he suddenly thought that this was not enough. So he went back downstairs and collected the blood of the undead. He took out another cold crystal and dripped the blood on it. However, the undead's blood didn't show any signs of melting. Instead, it fell on the cold crystal and was frozen into a dark red teardrop before it fell to the bottom of the cold crystal. Dean was relieved. My blood has been changed by the magic mark. The cold crystal can't erode my blood. It means that I should be able to directly absorb the cold crystal. He held the cold crystal and wanted to absorb it directly. But there was still a trace of hesitation in his heart. Although he was very clear that he was at least 90% sure of his speculation, there was still a trace of fear for the unknown cold crystal. Moreover, he knew that any experiment needed to be tested repeatedly. Only if the experiment was stable for a long period could it be regarded as a success. He was not sure if there would be any sequelae or side effects if he absorbed too much cold crystal. After all, the cold crystal was too strange. After thinking for a moment, he finally gave up the impulse to absorb the cold crystal. After all, he only had one life. It was better to be cautious. Dean put the cold crystal into his backpack. He grabbed the bow and arrows and continued to hunt the undead. He was ready to wait for his secret experiment to be completed. Then he would slowly study the secret of cold crystal so that he could make perfect use of it. Time passed quickly. Dean hunted all the way in area number 7. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. The number of cold crystals he had hunted was up to 600, which was equivalent to more than 600 gold coins. In these 2 days, he occasionally encountered some big monsters. He hadn't seen the monster illustrated book, so he couldn't identify the level of the monsters. He could only avoid them. I'll hand over half of these cold crystals and keep the other half. Maybe I'll build a secret base outside the giant wall. Dean thought in his heart while hunting. Suddenly, a familiar smell floated into his nose. Dean was startled. A graceful figure suddenly appeared in his mind. It's her! He would never mistake this smell. It was the bloody swordsman Linda who had almost injured him. About 30 miles ahead. Is she also hunting in area number 7? Dean's eyes flashed. He suddenly remembered that area number 7 was the focus of Consortium's cleaning. It didn't seem strange for Linda to be here. His face couldn't help but change as thoughts flashed in his mind. The so-called enemies on a narrow road flashed in Dean's mind when they first met at the scavenger headquarters. His heart was filled with killing intent. But at the same time there was a voice in his mind. It was just a verbal conflict. There is no need to escalate to the point of killing. After such a long time, perhaps she has already forgotten about me. Even if she remembered, it would only create a little trouble for me. However, another idea emerged in his mind. This is outside the giant wall. Even if I kill her, no one will know. Moreover, she is not protected by the law inside the giant wall. Even if people know, there is no way to convict me. Even if I kill her, no one will know. Instead, I won't encounter any trouble in the future. Although she is an intermediate hunter, but it's better to strike first and gain the upper hand. Killing is still too ruthless. If I kill her, no one will see. Dean suddenly thought of the hunter who had forced him into a desperate situation. Now he already knew the identity of the hunter. His name was Byrne, the younger brother of that woman. For a time, his heart was hesitating but suddenly became firm. She will never give up. This time I am in the training camp, so there is no way to deal with me. Once I leave the training camp, she will definitely find ways to plot against me. Cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. The people who have offended must be dealt with cleanly, thoroughly. Dean looked at the scar on his right hand. His soft heart suddenly hardened. He clenched the bow and looked at the big bag of cold crystals in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, but finally gritted his teeth. He took out a cold crystal and cut his palm. Blood seeped out and stained the cold crystal in his palm. Suddenly, the cold feeling poured into his body through his palm. It seemed to enter all the meridians in his body. With my current strength, even if it is an ambush, it will be very difficult to kill her. I only hope that the speculation of the cold crystal is correct, but I can't absorb too much. Dean pursed his lips. He felt the cold crystal in his palm disappear little by little. His heart was getting more and more nervous. After a while, until there was no abnormality in his body, he was a little relieved. He took out another cold crystal and carefully held it. He continued to absorb. Once his body felt uncomfortable, he would immediately stop. This is my only chance to fight back. It is a God-given opportunity, Dean secretly said in his heart. When the training is over, I will go outside the giant wall. At that time, I will let her need me. Only by seizing this opportunity can I avoid future troubles. Cold crystal, ah, don't make any trouble. He could not help but secretly pray. This was a risky move, but if he did not take risks in the future when he came out of the training camp, the situation would be more difficult. He would rather firmly grasp the opportunity in his own hands than let the opportunity fall into the hands of others and then passively fight back. Chapter 113. In the 7th Zone, on a ruined street, 20 to 30 corpses were lying on the ground. Their heads were cut off or cut open. Their decaying bodies exuded a faint stench which attracted some bloodthirsty flies to gnaw on the corpses. 5 figures were sitting on a pile of stones next to the corpses. They took out their dry food and enjoyed their lunch. They weren't disturbed by the stench of the surrounding area. Our mission will be completed if we kill one more Deinonychus beast. Linda was eating dry food while looking at the map in her hand. She was thinking about the favorite habitat of Deinonychus beasts. Gale, who was next to him, laughed. Captain, you should have enough points to buy a drop of angel's blood after the completion of the task. Then your magic marks will transform again, and you will be the 3rd senior hunter in our consortium. Gale laughed. Gale was standing next to Gale. Gale looked at Gale. It depends on luck. Linda looked indifferent. She wasn't too excited. I believe that Captain will definitely succeed, another dark-skinned girl said in a flattering tone. Several others also quickly congratulated her. They seemed to be more confident than Linda herself. Let's not talk about this matter for the time being. Gale, prepare yourself. After we find the next Deinonychus beast, we will act according to the previous plan. You pretend to be injured. I will send a message to the Black Pavilion saying that we encountered a rare monster. Let them send someone with the ability to track the scent of the Deinonychus beast. Linda closed the map. There was a bit of coldness on her face as she said. Gale smiled. Keep it on me. It will be as good as real. But will the consortium be willing to send the kid out? The dark-skinned girl asked. Linda indifferently smiled. Of course they will. You don't understand the consortium's approach. At present it is a great opportunity. There are several hunters in the consortium who have the ability to track the scent of the Deinonychus beast. They are either performing tasks outside the giant wall or are injured. Although this kid is a newcomer and has a rare magic mark, but in the end, he is still an ordinary person without a light physique. No matter how much potential he has, it will all be in vain. Haven't you heard that the consortium is too lazy to spend resources to send him to the hunter school to train him? The dark-skinned girl thought for a moment and nodded. That's true. Once the consortium transfers this brat into our team, we'll be at their mercy. Once we're tired of torturing him, we'll cripple him and throw him into the zombie horde. We'll destroy his corpse and go back to the consortium to tell them that it was this brat who scared away the rare-named monster we found. Even if the consortium suspects us, they won't be able to say anything. The others looked at each other and smiled. Linda slightly narrowed her eyes. She had been paying attention to Dean's situation and couldn't wait to see him. Pay attention not to leave any clues. Don't let the consortium's investigation team trace any clues. Although the consortium won't do anything to us even if they know about it, but the consortium is very disgusted with internal strife. They will gradually marginalize us and even assign dangerous tasks to us. Gale's character was calm as he said to Linda. Naturally. Linda indifferently said. They ate and chatted. Soon the meal was over. Linda stood up and patted the dust on her body. Let's go to the Red Lake. There may be traces of the Deinonychus beast. Okay. Several people nodded. After cleaning up, everyone followed behind Linda. They followed the map to a place where there was a lake. Dean felt the cold crystals gradually disappear from his palm. In just a moment, he had absorbed 30 cold crystals. His body still didn't feel any discomfort. Instead, his vision and hearing had improved a lot. Especially his sense of smell. Before he could only vaguely sense the approximate position of Linda, but now he could narrow the range to 1 kilometer in diameter. Dean quietly followed the smell as he absorbed the cold crystals. At the same time, he smeared a new layer of undead powder all over his body to ensure that the smell wouldn't be detected by the other party. After absorbing hundreds of cold crystals, Dean gradually felt a burst of heat in his body. His body temperature seemed to have risen a lot. He immediately stopped and didn't dare to continue to absorb cold crystals. At the same time, he was secretly shocked. There was a kind of addictive feeling in the process of absorbing cold crystals. When he came back to his senses, there was a bit of fear. It must be known that each of these cold crystals was the size of a ping-pong ball. Even if hundreds of them melted into water, it would be enough to fill several bottles. At the moment, even if it was a one-off saline drip, it would still make people uncomfortable. Dean's body temperature gradually returned to normal as he stopped absorbing the cold crystals. He was relieved and didn't dare to continue to absorb too much at once. He wrapped the rest of the cold crystals and found a place to hide along the way. Then he carried the bow and quiver on his back and followed Linda's scent. The distance between the two was getting closer and closer. Linda and others moved slowly as if they were still hunting along the way. Dean was smeared with undead powder and sneaked at full speed. Moreover, he was approaching in a straight line. Ambush and shoot. My shooting range is too close. Even if I kill Linda, the others next to her will find me and kill me. Dean was like a hound as he chased. Relying on bow and arrows alone is not enough. I can only rely on the third party's power, equipment and environment. Traps are also a kind of equipment. Although it is a thief's equipment, there is no rule that hunters can't use traps. But the production is too rough. If there is a thief among them, they will certainly not be fooled. His eyes were deep as many thoughts flashed in his mind. Time passed. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. At the moment it was the rainy season. The sky outside the giant wall was cloudy. The light was dim during the day. The ruins of the city were like a desolate doomsday. Heavy rain had just washed the air. The rotten smell in the air seemed to be a lot fresher. In the Red Lake area, at the edge of the vast lake, the weeds were so dense that they completely covered the road by the lake. The sightseeing boats tied to the lake had long since rotted. The shadows of the boats were like skeletons, leaving only the rotten iron frames. Some boats had even been capsized, leaving only a rotten rope tied to the shore. With the gentle swaying of the lake, the rope could be torn apart with just a little force. Linda and others were squatting in the grass. They were secretly watching the surroundings. They had been here for 2 days. According to the previous hunting experience, it was neither long nor short. There is no smell of Deinonychus. The footprints were left many days ago. It should have gone far. The dark-skinned girl said impatiently. Linda said in a deep voice, "Since it has been here, it will definitely come back." They could only continue to hold their breath and wait. Suddenly, Gale's nose slightly sniffed. His face slightly changed. He whispered, "We are being followed." Followed? Linda was startled. There was a trace of killing intent in her eyes. Is it another team? Chapter 114. A person. All of them were surprised. Gale nodded slightly and said, "He should have smeared undead powder on his body to cover up his smell. In the past 2 days I have always smelled an undead chasing us. I thought it was just an aimless wandering undead, but it was obvious that he was chasing us in a straight line. Moreover, he stopped twice when it rained. If it was a real undead, then it wouldn't care about the rain. It shows that he was worried that the powder on his body would be washed away. So he was forced to stop." Linda thoughtfully said, "Listening to you, this person's tracking method is very immature. He thinks that he can use undead powder to cover up his track. If he is chasing us in a straight line, then it means that he is coming for us. His tracking method is mostly based on our smell. Since he has the ability to track us, he should know how to rely on undead smell to cover up his scent. He can only track prey, but it is easy to be exposed when tracking others. Unless he doesn't know that we have Gale in our team." The dark-skinned girl was puzzled. "He doesn't know our team's information, but he dares to track us. Is he a stowaway from another consortium?" Linda's face was cold. "Maybe he is a junior rookie who strayed into our area. Humph, he doesn't know how to tuck his tail between his legs. Even if we kill him, we won't be able to find a reason. Instead of killing him, it is better to capture him alive and hand him over to the consortium," Gale said. Linda got up. "Let's go and see. If he is pleasing to the eye, then let him stay. If he is not pleasing to the eye, then kill him. That dino-clawed beast. Nick, Reed, both of you stay here. If there is a situation, use magic smoke bomb to inform us." Hearing Linda's command, the remaining 2 nodded. Linda took Gale and the dark-skinned girl and quickly chased in the direction that Gale pointed out. On a desolate street. After the heavy rain, the broken streets were covered with mud. The roads were full of potholes. The moss and vines on the ground were soaked in the rain. They were green and attractive. Dean was lying on top of a tall building. He looked at the sky. The muddy light and thick clouds indicated that heavy rain was coming soon. The rainy season is really frequent, Dean said to himself. He took out a few arrows from the quiver on his back and wiped them one by one. The arrowheads were rubbed until they shone like snow. After wiping the rain off the arrows, Dean took out dry food and chewed it slowly to restore some heat to his body. At the beginning of the rainy season, the temperature was still very cold and not suitable for hunting. Large monsters would rest in their nests and sleep. Only some bloodthirsty prey would wander around looking for prey. After he finished eating, he picked up a bowl of rancid blood next to him. This was a bowl that he found in a residential room. Time and radiation had destroyed what humans had built, but most of the mud that originated from nature had been preserved. At this moment, the blood in the bowl was bubbling from time to time, and tiny blood-red maggots were rolling out of the bubbles. They were as bloodthirsty as leeches. Dean inserted the arrow into the bowl and dipped it in the blood. He smeared the blood on the upper half of the arrow with a cloth. It was like painting a layer of blood-red paint. Soon, all 6 arrows were painted with a layer of blood and loaded into the quiver. "It's coming." Dean looked at the gathering dark clouds in the sky. The faint sound of thunder seemed to resonate with his heart. He squinted his eyes and looked at the street in the distance. There were 3 figures approaching quickly. There was no smell coming out of their bodies. They were like 3 silent stones. Dean was lying on the ground. He was staring at the graceful figure. The sharp arrow was firmly locked on her head. He was waiting for her to enter the shooting range. 300 meters away from him, Gale lowered his body and whispered, "He's on the top of the tall building at 9 o'clock. He should be alert when he smelled our scent. He's motionless now. I think he's waiting for us to take the bait." "Quickly kill him," Linda said coldly. "Be careful of traps," Gale said. "His ability is likely to be a thief or a hunter. We have entered his shooting range. If he is a hunter, then the best time to shoot us is the moment we rush into the tall building. So be careful. If he is a thief, then the trap is likely to be buried in front of the tall building." The dark-skinned girl peeked from the corner of the wall and said, "The ground is flat and there are no traps. If there are traps, then it will be in the tall building." What she learned was the thief's techniques, including pathfinding and trap-making. She had absolute confidence in her abilities when it came to traps, unless the other party was an intermediate thief, whose knowledge of traps far surpassed her understanding of the concept of traps. However, that was impossible, as her immature tracking skills had already revealed everything. "Climb from the wall. I'll cover in front. Both of you climb from the left and right side." Linda quickly made a decision. She knew that the longer they dragged, the more time the other party would have to prepare. She wanted to catch them off guard so that they wouldn't expect them to come so fast. Yes. Both of them immediately followed the order and split up. Linda pulled out the long sword from her back. She took a deep look at the tall building. The soles of her feet suddenly exerted force as she rushed forward at full speed. She held the sword in front of her chest and stared at the top of the tall building. She was confident that if there was an arrow, she would be able to parry it with her swordsmanship. Break through. This was her fighting style. Although she was a woman, her temperament was more straightforward than a man's. She knew that she was exposed to the enemy's line of sight when she stepped out of the hiding place. She quickly calculated the distance in her mind. 250 meters, 200 meters, 180 meters. When she was close to 120 meters, she still didn't see any movement on the top of the tall building. She couldn't help but wonder if the other party was sleeping. Didn't he realize that they were counterattacking? In addition to this doubt, there was an inexplicable uneasiness in her heart. But at this moment the arrow was already on the string. She quickly came to 100 meters away. If she continued to move forward, she would be at the bottom of the tall building. The distance between the tall building and the ground was about 60 meters. The other party still didn't shoot an arrow. She had a faint feeling that something was wrong. but her body was already at the bottom of the building. She hesitated for a moment before jumping up along the wall. Her fingers tightly clasped the severely corroded wall. She quickly climbed up. If she stopped, the wall would fall off. Since it couldn't bear her weight, she could only rely on her speed to climb up quickly. Just as he climbed to the 3rd floor, he suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. She was aghast and quickly looked back. Whoosh! Chapter 115. The enemy was coming from behind. At the moment of pain, Linda's mind was instinctively thinking of many ways to deal with the enemy. She held back the meaningless screams and quickly raised the one-handed sword in her hand to block in front of her body. At the same time, she let go of her other hand and fell down. The height of a 3-story building, coupled with her physique and her ability to deflect the force, would not injure her. After landing, Linda looked at the direction where the arrow came from. There was a tall building across the street, but the height was not as high as the one she had climbed. Because of this, she instinctively thought that the enemy would ambush in the tallest building instead of the one next to it. Although it was just a hasty glance, but she still noticed that the arrow came from the top of the building. The enemy was on the top of the building. When she looked up, she happened to see a small figure standing up from a low depression in the wall of the building. He was holding a bow and arrow, quickly knocking the arrow and shooting at her again. How, it's him! Linda was stunned when she saw the face of the figure. The horror in her heart made her forget the pain on her face. She never thought that the person she was going to kill would appear outside the giant wall. Moreover, he appeared in front of her, followed her, ambushed her, and even almost killed her. Whoosh! The sound of the arrow breaking through the air awakened her. She hurriedly waved her sword to block. At this moment, her intermediate hunter's physique and superb swordsmanship were reflected. Although her reaction was a little late, but she still cut off the arrow when it flew close to her. The arrow broke and fell to the ground. At this time, Dean continued to put the 3rd arrow on the bow. The moment he put it on the bow, he shot it as if he was too lazy to aim properly. However, Linda didn't notice it. Her face slightly changed as she saw the 3rd arrow coming at her. She knew that it wouldn't be a problem to stand here and let Dean shoot at her. She quickly turned around and hid in the building behind her. Who would have thought that as soon as she stepped into the building, her feet would suddenly step on empty air? The moment she stepped into the air, she suddenly reacted as if she had been helped by God and quickly lifted her leg. However, the moment she lifted her foot and was ready to withdraw, a rope was ejected from the collapsed place and wrapped around her foot. The rope was a slipknot, and with a little force it would be tightened. At the same time, the other end of the rope suddenly stretched taut under the force of the ejection. Linda's foot was originally weightless, so when she was suddenly pulled up by a strong force, she suddenly couldn't exert any force. Her leg was pulled straight like a split, and even her body was turned around. In less than 0.1 seconds of panic, she quickly swung her sword and cut the rope around her feet. However, at the same time the rope was cut, the floor above the rope also collapsed, pressing down on her. She hurriedly rolled to the side to avoid the stone. She heard the stone hit the place where she had been standing. There was a loud bang and dust rose. She couldn't help but pale. She was scared and angry. She was a dignified intermediate hunter, but she was almost killed by a newcomer. If she hadn't reacted in time and cut off the rope, the stone would have seriously injured her. After all, there was still an arrow piercing through her face. If the stone hit the arrow, the wound would be even worse. Dean couldn't help but frown when he saw that the trap didn't hit. There was a trace of fear and helplessness in his heart. An intermediate hunter was far superior to an ordinary person in terms of physique and combat experience. She stood in front of the building and stared at Dean, who was on the opposite building. She didn't dare to continue to hide in the building behind her. Who knew if there were other traps inside? At the moment, she was seriously injured. Moreover, the previous few unexpected attacks had cast a shadow in her heart. She would rather stand here and use her sword to block. She believed that Gale and the dark-skinned girl should have been aware of the situation here. The other party was only one person. As long as she stabilized herself, Gale and the dark-skinned girl could easily capture Dean. However, she saw Dean put away his bow, turned around and ran. Run? You want to run after injuring me? The trap is useless, the trick is finished, and now you want to run? She was so angry that her body trembled slightly. The muscles on her face affected the arrow wound. The severe pain made her mind go crazy, but she resisted the urge to chase after him. First, there was a trace of worry in her heart. She was worried that there was a trap inside the building. Second, her injury was too heavy at the moment. If she didn't pull out the arrow, she would have to hold it with one hand. Otherwise, the arrow would keep shaking while running. The pain would be worse than death. Moreover, she felt that the arrow was stained with poisonous blood. From the familiar rancid smell, she could judge that it was smeared with undead's blood. She clenched her teeth and pulled the arrow out bit by bit. When the barb behind the arrow was pulled out, it hooked the tender flesh in her mouth. It was so painful that she almost cried. Although this was not the most fatal injury she had ever suffered in her hunting career, it was definitely the most painful one. Finally, she pulled out the arrow. She quickly took out the first aid from her waist bag and bandaged herself to avoid any hidden dangers and other infections. At this time, Gale and the dark-skinned girl rushed over. They were surprised to see the serious injury on Linda's face. "Quickly, Chase, we can't let him run," Linda said vaguely from the other side of her mouth. Gale and the dark-skinned girl looked at each other and quickly chased after Dean. He smeared the blood of the bone-biter rat. Damn! Gale sniffed. He smelled Dean climbing down the wall from the other side of the building. He didn't enter the building anymore. He called the dark-skinned girl and circled around the building to chase. Previously, the smell of the bone-biter rat lingered on the building. He smelled it but didn't care. Bone-biter rats were very common monsters. They could be seen everywhere, but he didn't think that this was the real hiding place of the other party. What he was chasing was just a fake target that had been swapped out. It was even possible that the other party's purpose from the beginning was to deliberately make him feel that he was being tracked. Thinking of this, Gale's heart turned cold. When the two went around the corner, Gale's face suddenly changed and hurriedly said, "Quickly, Chase, he is running away." The dark-skinned girl was surprised. She didn't understand the meaning, but she still sped up. At the same time, she vigilantly scanned the surroundings in case of an ambush. Damn! After chasing half of the street, Gale couldn't help but curse. He quickly said to the dark-skinned girl. He imprisoned 3 bone-biter rats in advance. When he ran to the meeting point, his smell was mixed with theirs. Now these bone-biter rats are running away in different directions. We have to split up and chase him. Chapter 116. He has already calculated the escape route. The dark-skinned girl was speechless. How can he be a noob? 33? Did he deliberately expose the smell to you to lead us to his ambush place? Gale's face was gloomy and didn't answer. It's too dangerous to chase separately. The dark-skinned girl hesitated as she saw Gale didn't speak. The other party is the one who injured the captain. Even if we catch up, we may not be able to deal with him. Instead, we will be defeated one by one. Gale thought for a moment and said, "All right, I've thought of a way to identify him. Even if he has mixed the smell of the rats so that we can't track him, but the tracks of the rats are different from humans. Some of them are too lazy to run after a few steps. Of course, the rats that are too lazy to run are likely to be him in disguise. In any case, I will identify him first." He breathed rapidly, allowing the smell to drift to the olfactory cells on the upper side of his nose as much as possible. In an instant, all the smells around him became clear. The smell of rain, the smell of moss, the smell of rotting corpses scattered on the ground, the faint smell of rotting stones, and so on, all of them formed a sensory map in his mind. In less than 5 seconds, he quickly opened his eyes and said, "Follow me." He quickly ran in one direction. The dark-skinned girl was surprised. "Found it?" "I'm not sure." Both of them chased after him and soon came to an open square. There was a lot of water on the ground. There were some monsters' bones and rotten limbs scattered on the ground. There were also moss and dark branches of dead trees. Gale raised his finger and pointed in a direction. There was a collapsed stone. But if one looked carefully, they would find that there were a few stones with less moss. "He is hiding there." The dark-skinned girl's eyes lit up. There was less moss, which meant that someone had moved it. It was likely that the person had prepared a hiding place in advance. However, she didn't dare to be careless. If the person was really hiding there, it meant that there must be a trap. She cautiously approached and carefully surveyed the surrounding terrain as well as the layout of the stones in case there were any trap. Gale followed behind her. At this time, what he could do was extremely limited. He could only hope that the dark-skinned girl would find a trap. There should be a cave inside. The smell is constantly going deeper inside. Gale whispered. He frowned and his muscles tightened. The dark-skinned girl held the dagger and carefully examined it. After hearing Gale's words, she carefully examined the dagger bit by bit. From the arrow on Linda's face, both of them determined that the enemy was a hunter. In that case, she was confident that in close combat, a thief would definitely be better than a hunter. Only a warrior and a knight would make her feel helpless. Of course, this was referring to an open and above-board battle. Therefore, she just had to be careful that the enemy would not find an angle to ambush her from among the rocks. The two of them approached the pile of rocks one after the other. In the gloomy sky, dark clouds swirled above their heads. A heavy rain was about to fall. "It's 40 meters inside." Gale reported the smell in a very low voice. The further the smell went, the closer the two of them got to the pile of rock. "There are no traps." The dark-skinned girl frowned, feeling nervous. The more there were no traps, the more terrifying she felt. When the two of them were about 10 meters away from the pile of stones, suddenly the sound of water echoed. However, it didn't come from the top of their heads, but from behind them. The muscles of both of their bodies tightened. Almost by conditioned reflex, they looked back in horror. Whoosh! A sharp arrow like a silver light penetrated Gale's throat. Instantly penetrated. Gale's eyes widened as he covered his throat. He made a painful sound and fell down. The dark-skinned girl's pupils shrank. She saw that in the center of the square behind them, there was a dirty pool. There were all kinds of rotten things floating in the pool, including the swollen body of the bone rat. However, at this moment, a figure jumped out of the pool. It was Dean. He actually hid in the pool? The dark-skinned girl's heart trembled. She saw Dean jump to the edge of the pool and continue to shoot arrows. She was scared and hurriedly grabbed Gale's body to protect him. However, she didn't escape but approached Dean. She knew that if she pulled away from a hunter, the other party would have 100 ways to play her to death. His only chance was to engage in close combat. She believed that the other party should not be an intermediate hunter. Otherwise, there was no need to use tricks. He could directly fight and easily kill her and Gale. Therefore, she didn't have any hope of winning. Whoosh! The second arrow hit Gale's face. Gale's life suddenly came to an end. Dean saw the figure approaching quickly. His face slightly changed. He quickly turned around and ran. While running, he quickly shot arrows. Once the other party abandoned the body and caught up, he would shoot arrows to cover. His heart was also pounding. Jumping out of the pool to shoot was an extreme test of accuracy. Fortunately, he had been practicing basic archery during this period of time. His accuracy was more than twice as high as the other hunters in the same batch. Whoosh! Dean ran to the back of a tall building. The dark-skinned girl was angry and afraid. She was about to let go of Gale's body to chase after him. However, she saw an arrow shooting towards her. She was scared and hurriedly lifted Gale's body to block. The arrow hit his chest. She looked through Gale's armpit. She saw Dean ran into a tall building without looking back. She suddenly hesitated. Whether it was Linda's injury or Gale's death, she saw the other party's terrible strategy. She was not sure whether there would be an ambush waiting for her in the back of the tall building. After all, she needed time to detect the trap. It was impossible to see through the trap at a glance. During this time, there was a hunter hiding in the dark of the tall building. It was terrible. What to do? She hesitated. Finally, she clenched her teeth and dragged Gale's body away from the square. She came to the edge of the square and squatted down. She pulled up the magic smoke from her bag and released it. Light red smoke floated out with a fragrance. It was the plant powder of the red smoke. Dean ran to the top of the tall building. He saw that the other party didn't chase after him. His heart was both relieved and regretful. He had set a trap under the tall building. However, he wasn't sure that he could rely on the trap to kill a primary hunter. After all, he wasn't good at making traps. He relied purely on his own brain. Not bad, not bad. Dean leaned against the wall and slightly gasped. He looked at the red smoke floating outside the square. He knew that the other party was releasing a signal. However, he wasn't afraid of anything. It was a mistake that the other party only chased after 3 people. Moreover, the only person in the team with tracking ability was killed by him. Now he was like a blind man. Instead, he could rely on the smell to track and hide in the dark to attack. She saw my appearance. Although she was angry, but judging from her character, she is cautious and selfish. She won't continue to track me without absolute certainty. After all, there is no way to track me. Unfortunately, her magic mark ability is the Bloody Ripper magic mark. She can control the blood in her body. The blood smeared on the arrow won't be able to infect her. Dean's eyes flashed as he calculated quickly. Chapter 117. The smoke bomb was fired for about a minute. Linda, who was wearing a black armor, quickly sneaked over. When she saw the magic smoke bomb, she had a bad feeling. It was an emergency signal that would only be used in an emergency. When she cautiously rushed over, she saw a dark-skinned girl holding Gale's body squatting on the ground. She was staring at a dilapidated building in front of her. She was weaving some linen thread and fine knife nails to make a trap. Her heart sank when she saw the arrow on Gale's face. When she got closer, the dark-skinned girl heard the noise and looked back. Her face was obviously relieved. She hurriedly said, "The enemy is in the opposite building. I don't know if he ran away from the back of the building." Gale, Linda was silent. She squatted down and touched Gale's eyes. She was silent for a moment. Then she said in a low voice, "Aren't there 2 of you? How did he do it?" The dark-skinned girl felt the hidden anger in her words. Her face turned pale as she recounted the previous incident. This little devil. After listening, Linda's eyes were full of killing intent. Her fingers were tightly clenched. Her cheeks' muscles were affected because of anger. Once again, the bandaged wound was torn. The pain made the anger in her heart more vigorous. However, she relaxed the muscles on her face in time to avoid the wound from healing. "Captain, do you know him?" The dark-skinned girl saw Linda's appearance and couldn't help but ask. Linda coldly said, "He is the new kid." "It's him?" The dark-skinned girl was surprised. Although she had heard of Dean's name, she had never seen his appearance. It was hard to believe that the cunning and sinister teenager turned out to be the lucky scavenger kid who got the magic marks. How did he come out of the giant wall? The smell that Gale smelled was obviously from the passage under the pile of stones. Does he have helpers? The dark-skinned girl couldn't help but ask. Linda coldly looked at her and said, "Don't you understand? He pretended to use the rats that he caught in advance to escape. His actual purpose was to lure you to the place where he prepared a sneak attack and hunt you in his home field. Fortunately, you are not too stupid. You didn't separate to pursue him. Otherwise, you would have been killed one by one. You wouldn't even have the chance to ask for help. The dark-skinned girl couldn't help but say, but Gale's sense of smell is not wrong. He is using Gale. A cold light flashed in Linda's eyes. The reason why Gale tracked us here is that the little devil had injured several other rats. Because they were injured, they couldn't run too fast or too far. Only this one ran the fastest, so Gale locked it as a target. As for the smell that you smelled drilling into the pile of stones, I think it should be a real bone-biter rat. When he was gathering earlier, he didn't cover up his own smell, but instead covered up the smell of the only uninjured bone-biter rat. When he arrived here, he placed the bone-biter rat in the passage of the pile of stones and let it escape. He then hid himself in the pool at the side and let the pool help him cover up his smell. Only then could he sneak attack you from behind. The dark-skinned girl was dumbfounded. Although Linda didn't see it with her own eyes, her analysis was reasonable. However, if that was the case, then this kid's strategy was too terrible. There was a chill in her heart, and she couldn't help but think of Dean jumping out of the pool and pulling the bowstring. Although calling him a teenager was still immature, the feeling he gave her at that moment was like a real grim reaper. "Captain, what should we do now? Continue to chase?" The dark-skinned girl hesitated. Linda's eyes flashed coldly as she stared at the tall building for a moment. She whispered, "No, he will come back. We just need to wait for him." She looked at Gale in her arms and said, "Incinerate him. There is undead blood on the arrow. His body has been infected. He will stand up after a quarter of an hour." The dark-skinned girl bit her lower lip and whispered, "I know." Linda made a gesture and turned to leave. The dark-skinned girl dragged Gale's body and followed behind. The two found a small building to stay. The reason why they chose a small building was because they were worried that the rainfall would be too heavy and the tall building would collapse. At the same time, they were also wary of Dean using the terrain of the tall building to attack them. At this time, the dark clouds in the sky rumbled as the long brewing rain started to fall. The two cleaned up an open space in the small building. They found some combustibles and burned Gale's body. It was raining heavily outside. The dark-skinned girl felt that the air was a bit cold. She looked at Gale's burnt black eye sockets and felt a bit cold. She suppressed the sadness in her heart and dug the soil to bury Gale's burnt body. After burying, she looked back at Linda. She saw Linda standing in front of the door, staring at the heavy rain outside. She didn't know what she was thinking. "Captain," the dark-skinned girl whispered, "will he really come back?" "Yes." Linda didn't look back. There was no emotion in her voice. "Previously, he used traps and ambushes to hurt us. Now that we don't take the initiative to attack him, he won't come back, right?" The dark-skinned girl whispered her thoughts. "He had to come back." Linda looked back at her. "He is smarter than we thought. Although I don't know how he came out of the giant wall, but he didn't intend to escape when he saw us. Instead, he tried to kill us. It shows that he had expected that we would try our best to kill him after the end of his training period. So he has no choice. He can only take this opportunity to kill us. Either we die or he dies." The dark-skinned girl was startled. "But he is just a new hunter. He was just a scavenger. He has never hunted before. How could he have such courage? Even without you, we are a team. He can't hunt us alone. How could he dare?" "It turns out that he dares to do so." Linda looked at her. "Although he is a few years younger than you, but his heart is decisive and cold. He is not inferior to you. Although he hasn't hunted a monster, but killing is his talent." The dark-skinned girl shuddered. "Fortunately, we didn't give him a chance to grow up. Otherwise, he would have posed some threat to us." Linda looked at the heavy rain outside. "He should be very anxious now. Previously, he used our intention to kill him to arrange a plan to complete his plan. Now the initiative is in our hands. He is afraid that we will go back alive. Once he misses this opportunity, he will die after the end of his training period. If you were him, what would you do to kill us now?" The dark-skinned girl was startled as she pondered. Chapter 118. They left. They didn't chase after me. Did they retreat? Dean sensed that Linda had left. There was a trace of doubt in his heart. Linda had seen his appearance, so she wouldn't give up. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility. The only hunter in their team is dead. They know that they will fall into my trap if they blindly follow me, so they simply wait for the hare to come? He pondered for a little and immediately understood Linda's idea. She knows that I am eager to kill her, so she is not in a hurry. Dean's face was gloomy. There is no chance for a head-on fight. If she sticks to one place and arranges traps around her, it will be almost impossible for me to attack them. If I let them go back alive this time, I will be in danger. She will rely on her identity as an intermediate hunter to assign me to her team. I will die as soon as I come out of the giant wall. There is no possibility of escape. They should be arranging traps at the moment. It is too dangerous to take the initiative to attack. What should I do? I can only wait? Dean wrinkled his brows. The only chance now was to wait until the other side relaxed their vigilance and mistakenly thought that he had left. Then they would come out and ambush him. But after all, the other side was an intermediate hunter. They had already perceived that he was a threat. Even if he waited, it would be difficult to fall into their trap. They would even call the other two team members to come over. If the four of them were together, as long as they were not separated, even if he could kill one of them, the other three would immediately catch him. After all, his range was only 100 meters. Moreover, his accuracy was not 100%. There was still a possibility of mistakes. Rumble. Thunder rumbled outside, illuminating the gray sky. Dean looked at the pouring rain. His irritated mood gradually calmed down. Thunder kept echoing in his mind. He suddenly thought that if he could use the thunder, wouldn't it be good? However, to subdue the thunder, the equipment needed was far from what he could make now. He could only think about it. Wait, use the thunder? Use it? A light flashed in Dean's mind. He couldn't help but be startled. His eyes lit up with excitement. Yes, why am I so stupid? I can't kill them by myself. Why don't I know how to use external objects? I only know how to rely on my own strength to fight. What's the difference between a pig butcher and a brainless soldier? Too stupid, really stupid. He patted his head, but his heart was very excited. During the rainy season, the rain came quickly and stopped just as quickly. The heavy rain gradually stopped. The air was full of damp smell and fresh smell of moss and vines. The stench of corpses and rotting things in the ruins was washed away by the rain and became thinner. The smell of rotten things in the ruins was washed away by the rain. In the one-story building, the doors and windows were all closed, and the original window glass was smashed. The tan girl found wooden boards and stones to block them, and the gaps were blocked with cloth and vines. Then, she lit a fire in the room. In addition to the two women, Nick and Reed, who were previously guarding the Red Lake, were also summoned back by Linda's magic smoke bombs. The purpose of calling them back was not because Linda was afraid of Dean, but considering that it would be difficult to kill the dino-clawed beast with just these two people. Instead, they would be eaten as snacks by the dino-clawed beast. Could that read of Linda's mind of the plan? The two. Read was that they the two of the two. Of the plan up. Of Reed and Rita of the two. That they would the two of them of Reed of them. Of them. Anyway, she wasn't in a hurry. If Dean was an ordinary child, she would most likely think that the other side saw that the sneak attack failed and retreated. But she didn't dare to treat the newcomer as an ordinary child. She didn't dare to look down on him. Gale was killed by that kid? Nick looked at the mound of soil in the corner of the room. Reed was also shocked. He looked at Linda and said, "Is what you said true? He is just a child. He hasn't reached the age of 13 yet. How could he know so much?" Linda coldly glanced at him and said, "Don't look down on children." Some people are bad since childhood. Reed looked at the gauze on her cheek. His lips trembled, but he didn't say anything. After all, the facts were in front of him. Are we going to wait like this? Nick couldn't help but ask. Linda indifferently said, Why? Are you not as patient as a newcomer? No, I just think it's too much of a waste of time. Nick whispered. Linda coldly snorted. If you think it's a waste of time, then go and find him and kill him. There's no need to delay. Nick was slightly stifled and no longer spoke. His magic mark ability was auxiliary and had nothing to do with perception. Don't worry. This kid doesn't have a light physique. The longer he stays outside the giant wall, the more uncomfortable he will be. Especially if he stays outside for too long. His body will show discomfort. Even if his infection is able to kill the virus that invaded his body, it will be difficult to resist the erosion of radiation. Linda confidently said, I will arrange traps around us. The longer we delay, the stronger our surroundings will be. Even if we don't do anything, I can kill him with my traps. Nick and Reed looked at each other and sighed. They felt a bit aggrieved in their hearts. An entire team of hunters and an intermediate hunter were forced to retreat by a newcomer. It was really vexing. Linda knew what they were thinking from their expressions, but didn't say anything. She just coldly snorted. She had already thought of how to crush Dean's body and suck his blood. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. These 2 days were calm. Dean seemed to have disappeared. He didn't appear in front of Linda and others. This made Reed and Nick think that Dean had left. But Linda firmly believed that Dean was lurking nearby, just waiting for an opportunity. After all, the three of them were also hunters. They knew that patience was extremely important in the process of hunting. At this moment, they and Dean were each other's prey. Once they couldn't hold back and expose themselves, they would become the one being hunted. They continued to wait, and another day passed. Linda finished eating the dry food and touched the wounds on her face. In just 3 days, the wounds on her face had basically healed. She didn't feel pain anymore. This was one of the effects of her magic mark. By controlling the blood flow, she could speed up the healing of injuries. This was an extremely important ability in hunting outside the giant wall. At least 1/3 of the hunters were injured because of old injuries, so they were unable to resist the repeated encounters with monsters and died of exhaustion. Moreover, the speed of healing meant that Linda would be bolder when fighting monsters. Even if she was injured, she would be able to heal quickly. So the hunters who followed Linda basically didn't have to worry about the prey running away. 3 days. Linda narrowed her eyes. She had a higher opinion of Dean in her heart. He was able to endure for 3 days without showing up. His patience could be regarded as qualified. The dark-skinned girl and others ate the dry food. They sat in the small building and rested in the most energy-conserving way. Dong dong dong. Suddenly the ground trembled. Chapter 119. What's going on? The 4 of them were shocked as they felt the ground tremble. They looked at each other. Linda suddenly thought of something. She hurried to the ground and listened carefully. The next moment her face changed. Not good, it's the demonic wave. What? The dark-skinned girl and the other 2 were shocked. Demonic wave was the most terrible disaster outside the giant wall. Even a small demonic wave could easily engulf 3 to 5 hunting teams. Run. Linda hurriedly stood up and took the lead to run out of the building. Run in a vertical direction to avoid the demonic wave. Several of them ran out of the building. Their rich hunting experience allowed them to roughly guess the direction of the demonic wave. They immediately followed Linda and quickly ran to the other side of the street. Rumble! The ground trembled more and more violently as if 10,000 horses were galloping. Boom! The walls of a nearby towering and dangerous building cracked under the tremors of the ground and collapsed with a loud bang, causing a huge noise and dust to fill the sky. Linda and the others didn't bother to look at it as they desperately ran. Whoosh! Suddenly, A cold arrow suddenly shot out from the small building. This arrow was extremely sudden. The few people who were fleeing in panic didn't expect the enemy to be so close to them. At this moment, the arrow broke through the air. Although Linda reacted, her body couldn't keep up with the movement. Moreover, the target of the arrow wasn't her, but the dark-skinned girl behind her. The dark-skinned girl's eyes widened. She had just raised her arm to block when the arrow pierced through her shoulder blade. The ferocious force knocked her body to the side as if she had been hit by a sledgehammer. She fell to the ground and rolled twice. Nick and Reed hurriedly took out their weapons and stood in front of her. They nervously looked at the direction of the arrow. The dark-skinned girl clenched her teeth in pain and refrained from screaming. "Are you okay?" Linda asked. The dark-skinned girl shook her head and said, "I'm fine. Don't stop, the demonic wave is coming. Run." Linda saw that the dark-skinned girl wasn't injured. She was relieved and quickly said. Nick helped the dark-skinned girl up. At this time, another arrow was shot. However, Reed was already prepared and raised his sword to block it. "He's hiding there." Reed pointed to the place where the arrow came from and said hurriedly. Linda clenched the sword in her hand and stared at the small building 100 meters away. She knew that Dean, who she wanted to tear into pieces, was hiding inside. However, the tremors were getting stronger and stronger. They were too close. If they fought with Dean, then the demonic tide would catch up to them and they would die without a complete corpse. The other party had anticipated this, which was why they dared to shoot there. She was angered to the point her body trembled slightly, but she endured it in the end. She'd seen too many life and death situations, and she was no longer a rookie that would be swayed by emotions. She gritted her teeth right away and said, "Don't care about him, let's go." Nick and Reed knew that the situation was critical, so they couldn't chase after Dean. After all, the other side could quietly sneak into this place. Who knew if there was an ambush or not? Inside the small building, Dean saw that as expected, they did not chase him but continued to run for their lives. The corner of his mouth could not help but curl up. He was able to sneak past the heavy traps set by the dark-skinned girl and lurk here, mainly by tracking the smell, always paying attention to the latter's action. Among the buildings around the small building, this small building was one of the few places that the dark-skinned girl hadn't set foot in. Therefore, he dared to come here boldly. Dean sealed the bag of blood in his hand and quietly disappeared from the small building. Whoosh! Whoosh! The four of them quickly ran and jumped on the broken street. Their movements were very fast. However, after a few minutes, the tremors behind them didn't get away, but got closer and closer. Linda jumped over a pile of stones and looked back in a hurry. Her pupils slightly shrank. She saw that in the street behind them, there were 7 or 8 monsters that were nearly 4 meters high. They were like lions and humans, with 7 or 8 giant human arms. Their whole body was smooth and hairless. "It's a herd of brainpecker. Damn it." Linda's face turned ugly. The three of them looked back and their faces turned pale. The brainpecker was an adult. They couldn't deal with any of them. Moreover, the speed of the brainpecker was extremely fast. It was extremely difficult to escape from them. "They have found us. We can't get rid of them." Nick's body trembled. Linda slightly gritted her teeth. "Rona, they followed the smell of your blood. That kid deliberately shot you so that you can lead the way for them." The dark-skinned girl named Rona's lips turned pale. When she saw the brainpecker, she had already thought of this possibility. However, she still had a glimmer of hope. She hoped that Linda would protect her for the sake of their old friendship, but she didn't expect that she would have to make this choice. She bitterly said, "I know. I won't let him get what he wants." "Thank you." Linda's expression was complicated. "I will take care of your family." "Thank you." Rona looked at her gratefully. She stopped and turned around. She looked at the 7 or 8 ferocious beasts running toward her with a bitter and desolate expression. She still had too many unfulfilled wishes, too many things that she had yet to enjoy, and she could only leave with regrets. She sadly looked at the oncoming monsters and raised her dagger. Puff! The next moment, one of the brain-pecker beasts that had run over first roared and raised its 3 giant arms. It swept them across Rona's body without any suspense, turning her into a ball of blood and exploding. Nick, Red, and Byrne had already run away without looking back. Hearing the sound coming from behind, the 3 of them trembled. Nick, who was at the back, looked back and saw that the herd of brain-pecker beasts did not stop and continued to chase after them. His face turned pale and he said, We can't run away. Turn the corner and cover the smell." Linda didn't look back, but her face was extremely ugly. She took the lead and rushed to a corner. She quickly took out the Walking Dead powder and sprinkled it on her body. Then she went into the broken building next to her. Reed followed closely behind. After covering his scent, he ducked into the small building. Nick was the last one to enter the corner. A few brainpeckers had already caught up to him. He just crushed the Walking Dead powder and sprinkled it on his body. Although the smell was gradually covered, the brainpecker was already standing in front of him. "Captain, save!" Nick's face was full of despair. Chapter 120. 7 or 8 brainpeckers roared after killing Nick. It seemed that it was difficult to vent the anger in their hearts. Linda and Rant, who were hiding in the small building, peeped at the brainpecker beasts through the cracks in the wall. They were extremely nervous. Their heartbeat was extremely slow, for fear of attracting the attention of these bloodthirsty monsters. It's okay. Reed held the hilt of his sword as he prayed in his heart. Brainpeckers don't eat undeads. They won't find us. God of light, please bless your people. Roar! Roar! The brainpeckers lost their target. They angrily wandered around the street. Their snake-scale-like tails were swinging on the ground. Linda and Reed were relieved as they saw that the brainpeckers didn't enter the small building. But they didn't dare to relax. They secretly prayed that the brainpeckers would leave as soon as possible. In this tense and suffocating moment, a sharp whistling sound suddenly echoed. An arrow broke through the air and shot towards the small building. Linda and Reed were scared. They almost ignored the hunter who had been hiding in the dark. Damn! Linda's fingers clenched into fists as she heard the sound of the arrow entering the small building. Her body was trembling due to her anger towards Dean, but she still retained a trace of reason. She quickly locked the direction of the arrow. She raised her hand to pick up the stones on the ground. Do you want to attract the arrows? Let's see if the sound is louder or if I throw the arrows. Whoosh! She quickly stood up and squatted down. She threw the stone in her hand. With a loud bang, the stone smashed into the opposite building. She had seen it very accurately, and it happened to hit a glass window. The sound was especially crisp. The 7 or 8 brainpeckers on the street heard the commotion and immediately looked over. In the next moment they roared and pounced over. However, Linda was stunned as all the brainpeckers, without exception, rushed into the small building where they were located. There was no time for her to think. The 3-story building quickly collapsed under the impact of the brainpeckers. Linda and Rant, who were hiding in the small building, quickly fell down. Linda's reaction was extremely fast. At the moment when the building collapsed, she jumped out of the window and landed on the other side of the street. She rolled over and climbed up without looking back. Red didn't have time to jump out and collapsed along with the small building. The stone hit his tall nose bridge and immediately rubbed it with blood. The blood stain was like a mark. The bloodshot eyes of the 7 or 8 brainpecker beasts locked onto Rant, who was in the rubble. They roared and pounced towards him. No. Rant was terrified. He waved his sword, but the brainpecker beasts pounced on him. One of the brainpecker beasts raised its head and bit the upper half of Rant's body. His internal organs and intestines fell down along with his ribs, and blood splashed to the side. At this time, the brainpecker, who didn't have time to share the food, saw Linda jumping to the side and immediately roared and chased after her. Linda's face was pale. Even if it was her, Being surrounded by so many level 15 brainpecker beasts, she would die without a doubt. She turned and ran, throwing away everything that could be discarded, including some of the precious demon materials that she had hunted earlier. Roar! Roar! The group of brainpecker beasts roared and chased after her. After they left, a figure jumped out from the ruins of the opposite building. It was Dean. He glanced at the pool of blood in the collapsed building. His face slightly changed as he felt a bit nauseous. This was the first time he witnessed the scene of a monster eating a human. He could almost feel the fear of the young man who was bitten by the monster. He retracted his gaze and looked at the thick pile of stones next to him. The arrow and the blood bag tied to the arrow were pressed inside. He had to abandon them. He looked at Linda's 2 backpacks. One of them was bulging and exuded the smell of various monsters. It should be the valuable materials that Linda collected from the corpses of the monsters. The other one was her life bag. If it wasn't for the fact that the first aid kit was light, she would have thrown it away. Dean picked up her life bag and found a few pieces of dry food. He immediately chewed and ate them. He had been searching for monsters for the past 3 days, so he didn't eat much. He was so hungry that his hands and feet were soft. While he was eating, he suddenly smelled the smell of blood on Linda's body. He didn't expect her to be injured so quickly. It seemed that the group of monsters that he had spent so much effort to find were really powerful. It's best to kill them directly, Dean secretly thought. At this time, he suddenly smelled that Linda's smell was a lot lighter. To be precise, it was mixed with other smells. The smell was rancid and sour. He couldn't help but think of a place. Sewer. She ran into the sewer. Dean slightly narrowed his eyes. From the smell, it seemed that the monsters stayed on the street outside and didn't go in. Most of them were too big to drill into the sewer. I can't use her anymore. I still have to rely on myself. Dean's eyes slightly flashed. He didn't expect to attract so many fierce monsters but still couldn't kill Linda. The survival ability of an intermediate hunter was really extraordinary. He wasn't in a hurry to catch up because he smelled Linda's smell. She slowly slowed down after entering the sewer. It seemed that she was aware that the monsters weren't chasing and was taking the opportunity to restore her strength. Now that she is prepared, ambushes and sneak attacks will be difficult to work. Moreover, the previous diversion strategy has been used once. She shouldn't be fooled a second time. Dean frowned. Things had become tricky again. He had no chance of winning in a head-on fight. Sneak attacks were also difficult to work. Was it really the end of this time? Unless my archery skills are a little stronger, I'll be able to ambush her and kill her with a single arrow. Otherwise, if she manages to fend me off, she'll be able to close the distance between us in no time and kill me. Dean clenched his fist and bowed his head in contemplation. Archery can't be improved in a short time. Even if I improve the bow and use spiral arrows, it will be useless. The speed of the arrows won't be fast enough. They will bounce off. It would be good if there were guns. But after 300 years, the guns in the police station have long decayed. Even if I find them, I won't dare to use them. I don't want the bullets to explode and injure myself. Dean's heart suddenly moved. Guns can't be used, but bullets may be useful. The gunpowder inside the bullets can be used to make bombs. He couldn't help but get excited. The guns in the police station had a special storage room. The bullets were the most important and the security was extremely strict. If the bullets were still in the room, then after 300 years, the gunpowder inside the bullets was very likely to be useful. Chapter 121. The sewer under the ruins had long stopped repairing. The light was dim and the air was rancid. From time to time, the sound of iron cans or low blows could be heard. It was impossible to distinguish whether it was caused by the rats or other unknown creatures. Linda suppressed her breathing, inhaling and exhaling slowly, trying to minimize the movement. She looked around vigilantly. Years of hunting experience made her understand that the rats were not the only monsters that liked to hide in the sewer. Under the interference of the darkness, her vision became narrower. She could only see the outline of things about 5 meters around her. If Dean was here, he would be surprised to find that the dark vision was not common to all hunters. It was also one of the supplementary abilities of his magic mark. Linda's ears pricked up, sensing the lurking danger through the subtle movements around her, so she could not let her breathing sound too loud. Squeak! More than 20 meters ahead, the rats suddenly screamed in extreme pain. The screams soon stopped, and at the same time, there was a burst of splashing sound, and then it quietly quieted down. Linda's heart tightened. She was not sure if it was a few rats fighting for food, or something else hunting them. However, she did not leave. Monsters that liked to eat rats were not that strong. As long as she was careful not to be attacked by them, she would be fine. She stuck to the side of the wall and walked over with light step. She was always on guard against the gutter next to her, in case something jumped out of the gutter and dragged her in. After groping for hundreds of meters in fear, she finally found an empty corner. The road here had collapsed, and a faint light shone in. The stench of decay was dispersed a lot. The bone-biter rats she encountered along the way all hid when they sensed her approaching. In terms of identifying the strength of the enemy, the weak bone-biter rats were even more sensitive than the large monsters. Linda climbed out of the sewer along the stones. The fresh air hit her face. She took a deep breath and looked back. Seeing that the group of brain-pecker beasts did not chase her, she was relieved. She quickly left the street and came to a nearby building. There were a few undeads in the building. When they saw Linda, they immediately roared and rushed to her. She didn't even look at them. She slashed out her sword like a whirlwind, and the heads of the undeads fell like autumn leaves. She found a place to sit down. Feeling hungry, she suddenly remembered that she had abandoned the bag. Her face became gloomy, and her heart burned with hatred for Dean. She secretly said in her heart, "This kid smelled my scent and got rid of the brain-pecker beasts. He should know that I'm not dead, so he will chase me. When he comes to me, it will be his death." Thinking of Nick and Rona, she could not help but clench her fists. "I will help you to avenge him. I will separate his body and bury it in front of your cemetery." After a moment of hatred, she gradually restrained her hatred and calmly thought about it. This kid has a lot of bad ideas. When he appears again, he will inevitably think of new insidious methods. If he uses monsters, then I will hide in the sewer or go to the neighboring region number 9. However, there are not many monsters that he can use. Brainpecker beasts don't eat undeads. He smeared undead's powder and hid in the dark, so it was easier to attract them. If it was other monsters, then they would eat him first. This is too risky, so he should not do it a second time. If he doesn't use monsters and only relies on traps, then he shouldn't know much. Although he killed Gale, but it was a pure sneak attack, not a trap. Moreover, from the beginning until now, it can be seen that his effective range is only a mere 100 meters. Linda's eyes were cold. She was aware of Dean's shooting range. She wanted to improve her shooting range, but it wasn't something that could be achieved in 3 to 5 days of training. Especially outside the giant wall, there weren't so many arrows for Dean to shoot. The training efficiency was extremely low. Within 100 meters, if he sneaked an arrow, then I would only need 3 seconds to catch up with him and behead him. Previously, there was a group of brain-pecker beasts chasing after him, so I had to let him go. If I knew that Nick and the others would die, then I would have killed him even if I was seriously injured. There was a trace of regret in her heart, but soon she thought again. He has no other way, unless he is really stupid enough to think that he can kill me with a sneak attack. However, instead of waiting for him to attack, it is better for me to let him attack and take the initiative in my own hands. Advantage is weakness. He used Gale's sense of smell to deceive Gale's judgment, so I can do the same. Thinking of this, a plan emerged in her mind. A whoosh. Dean ran quickly on the street, looking for the police station. Occasionally he smelled the smell of monsters, so he took a detour to avoid it. More than a dozen streets, but there is still no police station. Is the city's police station not in area number 7? Dean frowned. Suddenly, he saw an open space in front of him. There was a tall barrier, about 30 to 40 meters high, spanning hundreds of meters, and the middle part had collapsed. He did not know whether it was because of the rain or the baptism of war. Fortress? Dean was surprised. Although it was covered with vines, but the appearance left a deep impression on him. 300 years ago, when the disaster broke out, all the countries in the world built large defensive fortresses in the refuge cities. These fortresses were located at the city's various refuge entrances, and also the second line of defense after the national defense was breached. Now, as time passed, the old people died early, and the once tenacious and strong fortress had become mottled. Dean was silent. After a moment, he suddenly thought of something and quickly ran towards the fortress. Close to the fortress, Dean suddenly saw traces of artillery and bombs everywhere on the ground. One of the skeletons, the army green clothes had long faded, and it was still holding a machine gun in its hand. Under the corrosion of the rain, the machine gun was rusty. Although the steel of the machine gun itself was rust-proof, but the nuclear radiation in the rain was too serious, and the other components of the steel had long been damaged and deformed. When Dean saw the machine gun, his heart was pleasantly surprised. This defensive fortress really had a lot of munitions. Picking up the machine gun, Dean gently broke the gun's shaft. He pulled out the bullet chain from the back of the machine gun. There were faint traces of rainwater on the bullet. He looked at it and quickly unscrewed the back cap of the bullet. There was dark gunpowder inside, but it could not be poured out. It was invaded by moisture and hardened in the bullet case. With regret in his heart, Dean threw away the string of bullets and continued to move forward, ready to go into the fortress to look for more. Along the way, there were piles of bones everywhere. They were all white bones, and even the bone-biter rats were too lazy to chew on them. Some of the white bones had small patterned snakes hidden in them, and their tails were exposed from the ribs. Chapter 122. Dean came to the front of the tank and looked up and down. The surface paint of the tank had peeled off. The heavy machine gun on the roof was covered with moss and dust. It looked like a layer of stone sculpture. I don't know if the parts inside have decayed. Dean's eyes lit up as he climbed up the tank. He picked up the heavy machine gun and threw it to the side. He lifted the tank cover and jumped in. Roar. As soon as he landed, a hoarse roar came from behind him. Dean had already smelled it. The dagger quickly turned around and pierced the throat of the young undead in army green clothes. He had brown hair and scarlet eyes like other undead. From his appearance, he was a foreigner. Ah! The undead's throat made a drowning sound as it softly fell down. Dean noticed the faded national emblem on his uniform. It was the emblem of the United States of America. He had some doubts but soon thought of a place. The Freedom City-State. When the disaster came, the Western capitalist empires were the first to be destroyed. At that time, a large number of Western refugees were transported to Asia and entered the territory of Russia. At that time, the world united front and helped each other. The law of accepting refugees had long been abandoned. At least tens of millions of Western refugees were sent to Russia. The reason was that Russia's territory was the largest in Asia. Moreover, Russia's population wasn't large. The land area was largely deserted. Secondly, Russia had a large number of air defense tunnels built by the former Soviet Union. It was an excellent choice as a refuge. Did my father send the freezer to the Freedom City-State after I fell into a deep sleep? Dean thought of the types of buildings he saw outside the giant wall. He felt that it was possible. Did the Freedom City-State build the giant wall? Father felt that it was safer inside the giant wall, so he sent me over? But I remember that the so-called Freedom City State was a gathering place for refugees when I fell into a deep sleep. How could they build the giant wall? Even if they can build it, it should be in an area with abundant materials. The place where the refugees are settled is barren. It takes a lot of time to transport the materials. Dean couldn't help but think of another idea. This giant wall, is it really made by us humans? His heart trembled slightly. He felt that he knew too little. At this time, there was a bit of hunger in his stomach. He woke up. It was not the time to worry about this problem. He immediately kicked the corpse and looked inside the tank. Dean was disappointed to find that the tank had long been deserted. The damage caused by 300 years of time was too terrible. Dean left the tank and continued to sneak into the fortress. With his sense of smell, he could sense the sleeping corpses along the way. If he could avoid them, he would avoid them. If he couldn't avoid them, he would directly kill them. I didn't expect these undeads to sleep. Such a thought flashed through Dean's mind. Soon, he arrived at the interior of the fortress. It was dim inside, but it did not affect his vision at all. Roar! A zombie leapt out from around the corner. Dean was prepared. He stabbed the dagger into its face and nailed it to the wall. After absorbing hundreds of cold crystals, he felt that his physique was not inferior to other primary hunters. Previously, when the dark-skinned girl and others were escaping, he found that he could steadily keep up with their speed. It must be known that the dark-skinned girl and others were scared to escape. Their speed had long exceeded the limit. It could be seen that his physique was even a bit stronger than theirs. However, if it was a frontal battle, Dean was still not sure. After all, his fighting experience was too little. Moreover, through this sneak attack, he realized that battles were not simply a competition of speed, strength, and other hard data. After all, no one would be stupid enough to fight you head-on with a sword and a spear. Terrain, weather, mood and so on were factors that affected the battle. They could even cause a reversal effect. After pulling out the dagger, Dean continued to move along the dark corridor to find a place to store firearms. Squeak! He pushed open a room. 3 sleeping corpses suddenly raised their heads slightly and gradually woke up. Dean did not give them a chance to react. He quickly approached them. The dagger penetrated one of the heads. He pulled out the dagger and quickly stabbed the other one. The zombie opened its mouth and was ready to roar, but it was pierced by the dagger and died immediately. At this time, the other zombie had fully awakened. It roared and rushed over. Dean quickly bent down to avoid its claws. At the same time, he quickly stabbed the dagger. Puff! He hit the zombie. The zombie trembled and gradually fell down. Dean exhaled. He felt some cold sweat in his palms. At the same time, he was excited. After dealing with the zombies, Dean looked at the room and found that it was a command room. The military insignia on the shoulders of the zombies were a gold star. They should be major generals. His eyes were quickly attracted by a map on the table. The map was very large. It was the map of Asia in the old era. Although many parts of the map were destroyed by the dust from the roof and water stains caused by rats crawling, he could still see the general outline. So, this is probably the Asian territory of Russia, Dean thought. Dean thought in his heart. He suddenly thought that there should be similar fortresses in other areas that had been cleaned up. The scavengers should have taken the map back. The people inside the giant wall should know the true face of the world and how vast it was. The things sent back to the giant wall by scavengers are handed over to the Temple of Elements for evaluation. The Temple of Elements and the Holy Church seem to be inextricably linked. The Holy Church's foothold in the giant wall is inseparable from the ruler of the giant wall. Dean's eyes showed some thoughts. The Temple of Elements should have mastered a lot of things. In other words, the top leaders of the giant wall should have mastered a lot of things. But there are some things that haven't been announced. What is the reason? Just because these things blaspheme the belief in God? He frowned. He couldn't understand. even if they wanted to use faith to enlighten ordinary people, but there was still religion in the old era. The state also managed it well. Dean shook his head. He didn't continue to think about it. He put away the map and turned to continue to search other parts of the fortress. Half an hour later, he finally found the armory of the fortress. Chapter 123. Dean carefully looked at the rows. The firearms were arranged in an orderly manner. The firearms were piled on a metal rack on one side of the wall, and most of them were rifles and submachine guns. The mines were stacked on the ground next to them. There were 2 layers of wooden boards under them to prevent the erosion of the ground. But now that 300 years had passed, the wooden boards had turned black and rotten. Dean wandered around and found that although it was stored indoors, the corrosion of time was too terrible. All the firearms were scrap. The guns were not maintained, and the barrels were mottled with rust. They had become a pile of scrap iron. The mines were covered with thick dust. The load-bearing springs had long lost their elasticity. They were decayed and damaged. It was impossible to detonate the explosives inside. Even after 300 years of precipitation, the explosives inside the mines were likely to become hard mineralized. Dean didn't have any regrets. Everything was within his expectations. He found some grenades and mines as well as 2 rocket launchers. He was about to dismantle them when he smelled Linda, who had stopped about 15 or 16 miles away. The smell was mixed with a strange odor. This odor obviously came from a monster. This smell had long appeared in his perception range. It had been moving slowly and accidentally encountered Linda. I don't know what kind of monster it is. Is it strong? Dean thought. It would be best if he could directly eat Linda. As he sensed the 2 scents, he moved swiftly and quickly dismantled the landmine in his hand. The landmine was stuck very tightly, but the corrosion of time had caused the metal at the edges to decay. He forcefully pulled the landmine apart. Inside was a yellow mud-like explosive that had been invaded by moisture, like a piece of soft, wet soil. Yellow explosives? Dean was surprised to see the explosives inside the mines. When he was collecting information about black powder, he had seen other related explosives. This yellow explosive was one of them. It was equivalent to the evolved version of black powder, or TNT. It was powerful and stable. He didn't expect that this kind of gunpowder would be used in modern mines. Great! Dean was surprised. With this yellow explosive, even if Linda was an intermediate hunter, he would be able to kill her directly. Dean poured out the yellow explosive and scattered it on the ground. He broke off a small piece of the yellow explosive. He found a few pieces of waste paper and rolled them up. He quickly ran more than 10 meters away. The paper was mixed with too much mud. It was dry and hard. The burning speed was very slow, but it still burned inside. Dean looked at him quietly. Bang! Suddenly, without warning, an explosion sounded. The sound was extremely loud, and the ashes of the burning paper were blown away in all directions. Dean's eyes lit up. Although the explosives were damp, they could still burn and detonate, and the power was stronger than he had imagined. He immediately returned to his original position and continued to dismantle the mines, pouring out the yellow explosives into a pile. At this time, Dean smelled the smell of Linda and the smell of mutton. There was a strong smell of blood. One of them should be injured. Is it the monster or her? Dean's eyes flashed. The speed of disassembling the mines was getting faster and faster. When the amount of yellow explosives had accumulated to 20 or 30 pounds, he stopped dismantling the mines. He went to the metal rack and grabbed a few bullet chains. He twisted the primer cap on the back of the bullet. The black gunpowder inside was semi-hardened. He knocked it on the ground to knock some gunpowder out. He suddenly remembered the arrows and pulled one out. He used the arrowhead to remove the gunpowder from the bullet. Bullets were emptied one by one, and gunpowder was piled higher and higher. When Dean took out the bullets, Linda and the smell of mutton were separated. The smell of mutton stayed in the same place and did not move. Moreover, the smell was mixed with a strong smell of blood. It should be killed. Dean couldn't help but feel regret. But after all, this was area number 7. The strongest monster in this area was estimated to have not reached level 20. Linda was an intermediate hunter. As long as she didn't encounter some particularly tricky ones or was careless and sneak attacked, she could basically guarantee her own safety. Suddenly, he smelled a trace of blood in Linda's smell. It was very light. His nose twitched as he wanted to continue to smell more clearly, but the smell of blood gradually disappeared. He suddenly thought of Linda's magic mark ability, blood control. Is she also injured? Dean's heart moved. Although she could control the wound in time to stop the bleeding, but the smell of blood could overflow from the gap of the wound. This couldn't be covered unless the wound was quickly bandaged. In that case, he really couldn't smell it from so far away. Since she can control the blood, the speed of the wound healing should be very fast. At most, she will recover in a day or two. This is a great opportunity. Dean's eyes lit up as he quickly collected the explosive. While collecting, he firmly locked Linda's smell. Once she left his smell range, he would quickly follow her. However, Linda's movement speed was not fast. She stopped from time to rest. Dean was secretly happy. This showed that her injury was not light. Suddenly, he thought of a problem that he had overlooked. She knows that my smell can track her. She is likely to use this point. If she is injured, she will think of ways to get rid of me. If the injury is too serious, she will find a place to stop until the injury is healed. When he thought of this, he immediately calmed down and said to himself, if I were her, I would definitely try my best to lure me out. As long as I'm near her, she will be able to catch up to me and kill me. Well, there was a trace of coldness in his eyes. Since it is a trap, I will beat her at her own game. He opened the folding storage bag that was necessary for the hunter's wall. He put the yellow explosives inside and stored the black powder in his bag. After all, it was only used as a fuse, so the amount was not much. After the preparation, he looked at the arsenal. There was some reluctance in his heart. It was difficult to move the entire arsenal with his own strength. Sooner or later, scavengers would be dispatched to find it and bring it back to the giant wall and hand it over to the consortium. In the giant wall, the gunpowder is only used as a dye. Even the yellow explosives are used as a yellow dye. With the wisdom of the people in the Temple of Elements, they should be able to test the real role of the explosives. Is it because the explosives look like mud, so no one would think of using fire to burn the mud? Such a thought flashed through Dean's mind. It was not impossible. People's common sense would imprison their thinking. Black gunpowder was first created by accident. However, it is also possible that the giant wall has mastered the use of explosives. But after understanding the use of explosives, they treated it as dangerous goods and were strictly controlled. Dean thought that this was also a possibility. After all, this world wasn't the information age. It was very easy to block the news. Even in the old era, civilians relied on computers, TV, and other tools to disseminate information. They had seen it, but they didn't really touch it. But in this era, there was no such thing as fast transmission of information. Only newspapers. In the era of aristocracy, it was very difficult for newspapers to play a role. The things that could be reported were extremely limited. In any case, if the giant wall has mastered explosives, then there should be records in the alchemist's circle. But there is no mention of it in Roseyard's notes. Anyway, I will go back and inquire about it. Dean no longer thought about it. He carried his bag and storage bag and turned away to start his own hunting operation. Chapter 124. In a small building by the street that was covered in crack, Linda was sitting in the dark. She opened the first aid kit and replaced the gauze on her right arm and thigh. At the same time, she was vigilant of the surroundings in case of a sneak attack. I don't believe that you won't be fooled by my disguise. Linda secretly said in her heart. In order to make the trap more realistic, she deliberately went to the place where the beast liked to move. Her purpose was to use the beast's claws to hurt herself. The beast's hunting level was 17. It was an amphibious monster. Compared to the land, it preferred to move in the water. If it fought in the water, even a senior hunter would be bitten and eaten by it. But on the land, its combat effectiveness would be weakened a lot. With Linda's hunting experience and strength, she could basically hunt it alone as long as she was careful. In order to make the performance realistic, she always went all out. In fact, with the strength of the beast, even if she tried her best, it would be extremely difficult to defeat it. Therefore, she was confident that her disguise was absolutely not a problem. The next step was to see whether Dean had enough courage or not. After replacing the new gauze, she felt that the wounds on her right arm and thigh were still somewhat numb. She couldn't help but hate in her heart. The claws of the beast had paralysis toxins. It was an extremely difficult monster to deal with. If she couldn't control the blood flow and expel the toxins to a large extent, she was afraid that her right arm and thigh would be stiff and unable to move. When I catch you, I will inflict this pain 100 times or 1,000 times. Her heart was full of killing intent. She transferred all her hatred to Dean. She couldn't wait to peel his skin and pull out his tendons. While she was furious, she controlled the blood flow on her face to recede, making her face look a little pale, especially her lips, which were almost bloodless. She looked extremely weak. She slowly leaned against the wall, panting softly. Her hand was tightly gripping her one-handed sword, constantly on guard. But compared to her weak appearance, such vigilance seemed so futile. Whoosh! Suddenly, a cold arrow was shot from the window. The angle of the arrow was diagonally downward, aiming straight at her throat. The eyes of the dying Linda suddenly burst out. She suddenly stood up and waved her sword to block the arrow. Her target was instantly locked on the place where the arrow came from, the opposite building. Die. She did not hide her strong killing intent and jumped out of the window like a cheetah towards the opposite building. However, just as she arrived in front of the small building, her eyelids suddenly twitched. She felt a bit of fear in her heart. This was the instinct of many years of hunting. She instinctively felt a trace of fear in the bottom of her heart, and immediately stopped her body. Raising her head, she looked at the window where the arrow came from. Dean was no longer there. It seemed that he had escaped. She wasn't in a hurry to chase after him. Instead, she stared at him carefully. After a while, she suddenly said, "Don't hide anymore. I know you're inside. There should be an ambush there, right?" There was no sound from the window. "The fact that you've endured for so long means that you know that once you're exposed, I'll immediately catch up to you and kill you," Linda coldly said. "Although my disguise is very realistic, but with your temperament, you should be prepared before attacking me. After all, my wound has just been infected. It will take at least a day for me to recover. With your cautiousness, you shouldn't be in such a hurry to attack me." At the same time, she calmed down. Her mind had been affected by her own subjective thoughts, but now that she was thinking from the other's point of view, she could see things more clearly. There was still no movement from the window. Linda frowned. Was she thinking too much? Did he really run away? Thinking of this, her heart was a little uncomfortable. If she really let him go, then wouldn't her injuries be in vain? "Don't pretend I know you're inside." Linda didn't give up and continued, "You're hiding inside to lure me in. It means that your trap is arranged inside. But don't forget, even if I don't kill you this time, I will have the opportunity to kill you in the future. When your training period is over, you will die." Seeing that there was still no response from the window, her heart was filled with anger, but she tried to restrain herself. She sneered, "Then let's see whose patience is better." After that, she went back to her small building and sat down. She thought, "I don't believe that he is not anxious. He wants to kill me. This is the place where I can use the initiative. As long as he wants to act, he will be exposed. She sat down and rested while staring at the opposite small building. Gradually, her heart became a little irritated. She was a dignified intermediate hunter, but she had to be careful and vigilant against a rookie. She was angry and resentful. After all, it was very exhausting to be on guard against sneak attacks. However, she still held back her impatience and thought about other plans in her mind. As time went by, there was still no movement from the opposite small building. She thought, let's see who can afford to waste time. In the blink of an eye, it was night time. Her spirit became more vigilant. The night was the best for sneak attack. Her field of vision was compressed too short. She had to be 120% vigilant. In the middle of the night, she gradually felt a trace of sleepiness. When she felt tired, she suddenly woke up. Although she was an intermediate hunter, she wouldn't be able to bear it. After all, the other side could stay in the dark and relax, but she was always on high alert. She would be exhausted in a few days. She suddenly understood Dean's plan. That was to exhaust her to death. If these words were spread out, it was estimated that no one would believe it. A junior hunter was planning to exhaust an intermediate hunter. It sounded incredible, but such a thing happened in front of her. No, I have to replenish my spirit. Linda came to the corridor under the small building and found a corner to sit down. She leaned against the wall. There was no angle for arrows to fly around. This made her tense spirit slightly relaxed. She closed her eyes and fell asleep. Although she was asleep, she often mingled outside the giant wall. She would wake up if there was any movement. Therefore, she wasn't worried about Dean's sneak attack. The night passed calmly. Linda woke up and saw the morning light shining outside. She didn't expect that Dean wouldn't attack again. Was she worried too much in the afternoon? She was a little annoyed in her heart. Even if there was a trap inside, he was just a rookie. How much lethality could it have? She knew that she would worry too much, mainly because Dean's previous performances were too amazing, so she had to treat him with caution. However, after thinking about it carefully, the other side was a child after all, and had never hunted. Even if he had a lot of tricks, his temperament was still too poor. Perhaps he really saw her weak appearance, and could not help but make a move? She was annoyed and slashed the wall next to her. Her heart was full of self-blame and anger. Her painstakingly planned plan was missed by her. I'd like to see what kind of trap you have arranged, damn kid. She looked at the small building and walked over with her sword. As soon as she entered the small building, a faint smell of dampness and decay hit her face. The surroundings were dim, but there was a faint light coming in from the cracks in the walls and the windows. With the help of the faint light, her vision was not greatly affected. She looked around, looking for traps. Although she was not a thief, but after all, she was an intermediate hunter. She was very experienced and had seen a lot of traps. Moreover, Rowling often arranged traps in the team. She also saw some doorways. At the moment, on the top of the third floor of the small building, a figure was leaning against the wall. It was Dean. After the failed sneak attack yesterday, he didn't leave the small building. After all, this was the place where he ambushed the explosives. Once he left here, it would be more dangerous. When Linda called him downstairs, he wanted to provoke her. But then he thought that with the other party's rich experience, she should know how to control her emotions. Instead of using anger, it was better to use curiosity. Therefore, no matter how Linda called him, he didn't make a sound. His purpose was to deliberately mystify the other party and affect her judgment. However, to his disappointment, Linda didn't come in. Just when he thought that the ambush plan had failed and was thinking about other new plans, he didn't expect to hear the other party enter the building. She should still want to confirm whether I have left or not. It seems that she is a good hunter. Even if she can suppress her anger, she still can't resolve it. There was a trace of excitement in Dean's eyes as he quickly came to the prepared place. Linda came to the second floor along the collapsed stairs. She glanced around, but still didn't see any traps. This made her more and more angry, as if she was being played. Suddenly, she heard a subtle hissing sound, as if dozens of vipers were spitting out their tongues. Using the monsters again? Linda was startled, but the next moment her eyes lit up. He is still here. She clenched her sword and was ready to go to the third floor. Although she had considered the ambush, but her magic marks could restrain some poisonous monsters. Even if she couldn't beat them, she could still escape. Just when she was halfway to the third floor, vain boom! The sudden violent explosion instantly drowned the entire small building. From the first floor to the third floor, everything was blown up. Chapter 125. Countless stones splashed, and the sound of the explosion was like thunder, deafening to the ears. The small building that was on the verge of collapse was instantly razed to the ground, leaving only some scattered rocks in its place. The two neighboring buildings on the left and right were also affected by the explosion, and half of them collapsed from the impact. The smell of gunpowder spread in the air. Clang! Dean climbed out of the collapsed building and looked up at the flattened building. He was shocked. He did not expect the destructive power of the yellow explosives to be so amazing. Fortunately, he ignited the fuse and jumped out of the building in time. Otherwise, he would have been buried with them. His nose gently sniffed and soon smelled the strong smell of blood coming from Linda's body. The source of the smell came from the pile of stones under the building. He got up and shook off the dust on his body. He was ready to move the stones to check whether she was alive or not. Suddenly he remembered the last time he ate a loss, and stopped his footsteps. He thought that if she was still alive, she should be lying in ambush, waiting for him to move the stones and check the body to give a fatal blow. Thinking of this, Dean turned and left. After a moment, he came back with some cloth and withered plants in his hand. He threw them in front of the pile of stones, and then lit a torch and threw it. The torch quickly burned the dry wood and the cloth. The fire was strong and blazing. After more than 10 minutes, the fire burned out and ashes were everywhere. Dean looked at it. The flame only burned the outside of the stone, and only a few fell inside. If she was determined to endure, she should be able to bear it. He immediately turned away and took out 2 yellow explosives that were set in another small building on the opposite side. The 2 yellow explosives were sealed by the concave stone shell and soil, leaving only a paper rolled-up fuse exposed. Dean was about to throw one of the yellow explosives, but suddenly thought of something. He was scared and cold sweat came out of his back. He quickly turned away and went to a corner. He broke the gap between the stone shell and the soil, and took out the yellow explosives inside. Then he picked up the water on the ground and sewed it back to its original state. After doing this, he returned to the pile of stones again and lit the fuse of the yellow explosive shell. He waited for it to burn until it was only 10 centimeters away, then he threw it to the pile of stones. The explosives rolled on the stone floor, and the gap between the newly glued soil and the stone shell cracked a little. Seeing that the fuse was about to burn into the stone shell, the rubble was suddenly pushed away, and a bloody figure jumped out from inside, quickly grabbed the yellow explosives, and threw it backhand at Dean's face. Dean's heart tightened. He quickly raised his hand to block the yellow explosive. The fuse was slightly late, so the stone shell did not explode. Dean threw it away and gloomily looked at the bloody figure in front of him. It was Linda. Her left arm was broken from the elbow. Her armor was blown up and the fragments were embedded in her body. She gasped and stared at Dean. There were several burn marks on her face. Apparently, Dean's firewood fell through the cracks in the rocks and fell on her face. But she refrained from making a sound. Dean saw her ghost-like appearance, and his heart turned cold. Such endurance was completely beyond his imagination. It made him realize how terrible the existence of an intermediate hunter was. These thoughts flashed in Dean's mind. He threw away the empty shell of the yellow explosives and quickly held the black bow, nocked an arrow and aimed at the target. Whoosh! The arrow quickly shot out. At the moment, the distance between the two was less than 10 meters, and the speed of the arrow was extremely fast. Linda saw Dean throw away the stone shell and was startled. Although she didn't know what it was, but the familiar hissing sound showed that it was the thing that injured her. Why was there no sound at the moment when it was in Dean's hand? While she was in a daze, an arrow flew towards her. She hurriedly dodged, but her legs were too heavily injured. The arrow immediately hit her in the side of her abdomen, and the strong force sent her body flying backwards, causing her to fall to the ground. As for her one-handed sword, it was blown away by the explosion, and she didn't know where it fell. Dean quickly put the second arrow and continued to shoot. Puff! Another hit, and it hit Linda's shoulder. Dean was merciless, and continued to put the third arrow, aiming at her forehead. Linda used all her strength, and hurriedly dodged sideways, and the arrow brushed past her face. Dean frowned, and continued to backhand to pull out the arrow, but the arrow was empty. Linda turned back and noticed the scene. There was a trace of a gloomy smile on her face. "Little devil, if you want to kill me, then let's die together." She raised her hand to pull out the arrow from her side abdomen, and staggered to stand up. She took a deep breath and quickly ran towards Dean. Dean didn't choose to escape. At this moment, Linda burst out with speed, and no matter how he ran, she would catch up. He stood in the same place and stared at her. When the distance between the two reached 3 meters, he suddenly raised his arm. Whoosh! A shadow was thrown out from the palm of his hand. Puff! Blood sputtered out. Linda, who was running at full speed, suddenly leaned back and fell to the ground. There was a dagger in her throat. In such a short distance, the speed of Dean's dagger was not inferior to the speed of the arrow, so Linda couldn't react. After all, her injury was too serious. Unless she immediately returned to the wall for treatment, otherwise even if Dean didn't make a move, she would die outside the wall. Gurgling. Blood gurgled out of Linda's mouth, and her body trembled. This was the instinct of suffocation when her trachea was blocked by blood. Dean didn't approach her, but came to the side of the stone pile, and picked up a few stones to throw at her. Linda's body trembled, and her eyes moved with difficulty. She stared at him, and her mouth slightly opened, full of anger and resentment. Dean frowned. "You and your brother are quite similar. When your brother died, he was unwilling. Oh, I forgot to tell you, in fact, I also killed your brother." Linda's eyes suddenly widened, and her emotions were agitated. Her throat muscles were affected, and she coughed out a big mouthful of blood. Her mouth issued a whining sound, as if she was cursing, but also like crying in grief and indignation. She raised her arms to grab Dean's direction, but her body was too injured, so she couldn't stand up. Eventually, her arms were stiff in midair, and powerlessly slipped down. Dean carefully looked at her, and felt that this time it wasn't a fake. He immediately picked up a big stone and carefully approached her. When the distance was 2 or 3 meters apart, he smashed the stone on her head. Bang! Seeing that she still didn't respond, he was a little relieved. He quickly bent down and pressed the dagger in her throat. He swayed it left and right, and completely cut off her throat and trachea. However, this time Linda was really dead, and her body didn't have any reaction. Dean was completely relieved, and his tense body loosened. He felt his back was drenched in cold sweat, and immediately sat on the ground, gasping for breath. After a while, his physical strength recovered a little, and he found some withered plants to incinerate Linda's body. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.